Hello. Happy Saturday to everybody tuning in. I know I'm a little early today. I'm in a bit of a rush. I want to get this video reacted to, done and dusted by the time that we are done with this stream. So we've got an hour and about 10 minutes to go. I'm not going to give any preamble. I'm just going to react to it as soon as I can. And then afterwards, I might make some announcements about the new year and upcoming stuff. But for now, let's just get right into the reaction. We just made it through the first little bits, which included Margit, Godric, Renala, the Magma Worm, Star Scourge Radon, Real Ancestor, Gargoyle Duo, Estelle, and Lich Dragon Fortisac. So now we're getting into Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy. Let's get into it. I'm kind of rushing this. I apologize. I had planned to stream previous Saturday, but here we are. And I wanted to wrap this up by the end of the year. So here we are. Let's rock and roll for the last video of 2024.
I'm not the biggest fan of Rykard, but I do view him more favorably than I used to. On one hand, he's arguably the best presented fight in the game, with such an epic scale that makes it the most memorable gimmick boss in the whole series. On the other hand, because it tries to behave somewhat like a regular encounter, it exhibits many of the same problems that the rest of the bosses do. First off, I really like that nothing in the fight is scripted. Even though it places a heavy emphasis on visuals and theme, it is a full sequence of gameplay that you have agency over. There's no mid-fight cutscenes where you just watch your character kill Rykard, no quick time-like events, you're just given a cool weapon and a cool boss to use it on. I would also like to point out that Rykard only appearing once is a huge relief. If the Serpent Hunter gimmick appeared elsewhere, it would lose lots of its dramatic effect, for lack of a better word. But thankfully, the game never spoils Rykard's identity like that.
That is a good thing. Given the amount of repeated assets that we find in the game, both in the base game and the DLC, it is a relief that some of the more unique bosses were not repeated.
Spear is satisfying to use, the effect looks awesome, it's perfectly suited for this fight, I really have no complaints there. It feels like Yorm's potential from Dark Souls 3 has been fully realized with Rykard. When we delve into his moveset though, I'm less enthusiastic. I have a feeling that Rykard is one of the more polarizing bosses in terms of difficulty, one that has a very wide spectrum of people that found him incredibly easy on one end and people that could never click with it on the other. I fall more towards that latter side. He's always really frustrated me since I've never been able to find a consistent strategy. There's a few frustrating subtleties that crop up throughout the fight. For instance, while the arena is very spacious to make room for everything that's going on, I never know where I'm supposed to stand in relation to the boss. The Serpent Hunter has pretty solid range on most attacks, but I still often find many of them falling just barely out of reach. I also don't feel very safe standing closer since its animations are actually pretty long, and Rykard can attack with the frustrating frequency that many other bosses do. I'm well aware that this could be a skill issue, but it's annoyed me enough times that I think whatever the happy medium is too well hidden. Either that or it moves around too much since Rykard is always slowly inching towards you. That's not the worst thing about the fight, though. He has two attacks that are just straight up indefensible. The first is during phase 1, where he has the earthquake-like move where a bunch of fire shoots up from the ground. It's a really large AoE right in your direction, and as far as I can tell, is an instance of unavoidable damage.
That's one thing too, is after playing the game over and over and over for my own videos and on different sort of different ways, like I fought each of the main bosses several times over. I don't know if you can dodge that attack he just mentioned, right? The one that he was going over, like right here. Like I genuinely do not know if you can dodge it. I've tried jumping, I've tried rolling with it, rolling into it, running out of the way. I've tried jumping in different directions. I genuinely do not know if you can actually dodge this attack, like at all. I don't know if you can actually avoid this damage when he does this move.
Right in your direction, and as far as I can tell, is an instance of unavoidable damage. Running to the side, rolling in different directions, positioning at different distances, jumping, I've tried all of these things and nothing has worked. My guess is that they want you to run perpendicular to where it's coming from, but then it's like Godric's Whirlwind, it doesn't give you enough time to do the intended response. The Raining Skulls in Phase 2 are significantly worse though. Once again,
Oh yeah, fuck those raining skull things, man. This is one of those things where I feel like Rykard's. This is one reason why I kind of have mixed feelings about Rykard by comparison to the other bosses that have done this gimmick in the previous sort of games. You know, the is it the Storm Lord or Lord of the Storm, whichever the one from Demon Souls is, the name of it. I've always found that gimmick works really well because it's an enemy up in the sky, right? So you obviously need to hit it with something unique, right? And it puts a weapon in the middle of the arena that you can use. The attacks by the boss are fairly slow. They're high damaging, but they're fairly slow, right? So you can usually pick up on, oh, there is a glowing item in the middle of the arena. I should probably use it against the guy that is clearly out of reach, right? The Yorm gimmick completely screwed up pretty much every part of that, right? Yorm is on you. He's very aggressive. He hits hard, and he's actively chasing you the whole time, right? So your brain is clicking with you, oh, I probably need to fight him normally, right? You don't really have time to get the item in the arena and equip it in Yorm's case without running the risk of taking significant damage or wasting a lot of time fighting the boss normally, right? It is simply a bad it is simply a bad version of the gimmick from Demon Souls, right? Rykard, I think, is a step up in some ways and a step down in others. For instance, I think a lot of his attacks just waste so much time, right? Like the skulls falling from the sky that VG Matthew just mentioned. Those are ones that I think are critically like time wasting abilities, right? Because they come down for like a solid 20 seconds, right? Like it is a long attack that just wastes the player's time. And against a boss this massive who can hit you while the attack is going on and while you have a weapon that is ranged, but you need to be very close to him to actually deal any damage unless you charge it up, which takes time that will probably be spent dodging the skulls instead. You've essentially just delayed the encounter by having the skulls happen. And it's a thing where the weapon in this case is more versatile than the ones in the previous versions of this gimmick, but at the same time, you've made the boss far more complex to the point where you've put in a lot of arbitrary things that keep the player from doing things they're going to want to do, right? Like the magma sort of area around Rykard is clearly just to deter the player from getting up close. When we all know that if you do get up close, you actually manage to avoid several of his attacks. And I'll show that in footage in the Elden Ring video I'm working on. Right? It's one of those things where it's a way to discourage players from getting close to him, but at the same time, if you do get close to him, you'll actually probably do pretty well if you grab the weapon in the arena and then just rush him and then stay close to him the entire fight. Right? You will probably be able to do a significant amount of damage during that sort of strategy. Now, the optimal one is to stay back and then just hit him with very heavy attacks that will stun him usually. That's been the most consistent one that I've used. That has worked pretty well, but we still run into issues with the different moves that he's able to do in both phases that are just massive AoEs or the tracking skull things in phase 2, which are, again, very tedious to deal with because you basically just have to run away from them for a long period of time before you actually get some breathing room to fight back. And that tedium weighs down a lot of these boss fights, but Rykard in particular has several moves that are just very, for lack of a better word, boring to deal with because it's either an attack that you don't know if you can even dodge, like the little ground AoE directional cone thing he does, or you end up getting the skull thing where you basically just hold your sprint key to run away from them as best as you can. It's just one of those moments where it's unavoidable without having some tricky like 1% of the 1% of the 1% gamer strats, right? It's one of those things where just the ceiling to deal with this stuff effectively beyond the simple just run away or just tank the damage is like the ceiling for what is supposed to be the get good strategy here is getting too high. And it's not just for this boss, it's for several bosses in the game. And this is one thing that I think is problematic moving forward, especially after Shadow of the Erdtree having its own problems with kind of like the bosses in this game were overstuffing the difficulty, and the DLC only overstuffed the overstuffing. So now we're dealing with like a turkey that's been raped by different types of stuffing, right? We're dealing with stuff that's just overcomplicating the whole situation as opposed to making the fight more enjoyable through like a good balance of difficulty and damage. Now we're going for tedium as opposed to challenge. And that's really annoying that we're going in this direction.
Again, you can only avoid it through running away, but this time there's much less guarantee for your safety. Even when running away as much as possible, sometimes you can get unlucky and a skull will just block your path and you get hit. These two attacks are what weigh him down the most. The Skull Rain is the more puzzling one to me because even if you could consistently dodge it just by running, the time it takes for them to subside still puts a damper on the whole experience. It's one of those moves where it's hard to think of any redeeming qualities for it. Rykard can also freely attack you while the skulls are falling, so again, it's possible to get trapped in a risky situation. If he forces a roll at the wrong time, you're probably going to take a bunch of skulls to the face. On the bright side, most other attacks from him are pretty solid. Not to sound like a broken record, but a few of them are still too delayed for my liking, particularly the bite grab in Phase 1 and some of his sword sweeps in Phase 2. Once again, these look like pretty unnatural delays designed specifically to trip you up instead of testing any particular skills. It's a pretty big ask to overlook all of these problems, but if you can manage to, Rykard is pretty good. The most important takeaway is that he demonstrates how to properly combine a gimmick fight with a normal fight. He does so much better than Renala does. You still need to apply typical strategies to beat him, like rolling to dodge and finding safe attack opportunities and all of that, but the weapon that you're provided with makes the experience a lot more special. It's a gimmick that doesn't completely warp how you play the game, and while it is still a gimmick at the end of the day, it's probably one of the best that they've ever done.
All right, we disagree on that heavily. I think he actually is one of the worst fights in terms of screwing builds over because it's a gimmick fight where you have to use a weapon against him and use a lot of the basic combat mechanics that don't tie to builds 90% of the time. Right. And I think that is a inherent problem with gimmick fights like this, where a lot of builds are negated by the fact that the gimmick is so effective in this fight. Right. This is one thing that was a little bit easier when dealing with Yorm, because magic users would be able to target Yorm's head and deal significant damage that way. Not as much as the special weapon in his arena, but it is one of those things where Rykard benefits from certain aspects of Elden Ring's design in that he is more sort of more complex than the bosses that came previously. But with that come the drawbacks of having this same gimmick. It's the thing where you have this gimmick where the best way to fight him is with the weapon in the arena, right? That inherently discounts the effectiveness of any build besides that. But Arcane is a pretty consistently overpowered build to go with, right? Especially if you're using like a bleed thing or a frost thing or some combination of those two, like things that proc and deal a percentage based damage type, right? Those things are very effective against Rykard. But apart from those, Rykard's gimmick undoes the effectiveness of your build just so the game can have a gimmick fight like the other ones they've had in previous games. This is one thing where I think that overall, I don't mind the gimmick in any of the games. I don't mind this idea, but it has to be considered that you are negating several build types by making the boss fight work this way. You are actively telling players if you are a mage, drop that shit. You need to use the Great Serpent Hunter weapon, right? If you are a tank, you need to drop that stuff so you can use this weapon. If you're a glass cannon, you should drop that to use this weapon. If you're a faith build, you need to drop this to use it. If you're a dex build, you need to stop and use it. It's essentially the same thing of where you take a game that's all about you take an RPG, which should be about choice and customization of your character to fit a build or fit a mix of builds, and then funneling almost everybody into this one build type of use this weapon against this enemy and dodge the attacks. That's it. You're essentially taking all the bonuses of playing an RPG system or playing an RPG game with an RPG system for leveling up and customization, and you're undoing all that just for the sake of this one boss fight. And then when you go back out into the world, you go back to the RPG ness of it all. It's one of those things that I think does detract from the overall game experience in general. While visually I think Rykard might be the most interesting, just because his animation is very unique, it is one of those things where mechanically he does sort of tunnel vision the whole idea of playing the game during his fight. And it's a thing where, while I don't have anything against gimmicks in general, I do think this one is sort of an overused trope at this point. And I think they could make something more creative that still allows the builds to fight the boss in a different way, rather than just having boss that's excessively weak to a specific weapon. I think that's just a lazy way to make a gimmick fight. I think it's just a really lazy way to make a gimmick fight, and I wish that they would make more unique gimmicks as opposed to this.
Willful traitors. All.
Morgott was once a contender for my favorite boss in the game. In hindsight, I think I was being a bit too generous and letting the story context carry most of the fight. Elden Ring's story peaks at this moment in my opinion, but defeating Morgott marks the beginning of the endgame, which is easily the worst part in terms of gameplay. Never mind that though, nearly every fight so far has had a strong theme and atmosphere, and I'm tempted to praise Morgott for the same thing, but we're far enough in the game now that I don't think the spectacle should continue being the best things about these fights. It's clear by this point that every fight on this list is presented well, and that the thing that's been lacking is a fantastic boss with nothing to complain about. Morgott still isn't that boss, but he is very interesting, and he's a good opportunity to elaborate more on something I generally hate about bosses across the board. Bosses in this game attack way too often, and when I say that
Yes.
FromSoft tried too hard to surpass their previous games, this is one of the better pieces of evidence. Going back to Dark Souls 1 for a little bit after playing Elden Ring has really opened my eyes to how ridiculously short the downtime is between most bosses' attacks. It often feels suffocating with how many combos they'll dish out in such a short period without giving you an equal chance to retaliate. Obviously, the games have sped up since Dark Souls 1, so it might not seem like a fair comparison, but the other games have always sped you up with the enemy. When it comes to Elden Ring, it feels like bosses have been sped up way more than you have. It's like playing a chess game where your opponent gets to make 3 moves every turn while you can still only make 1.
That is a really good analogy. That is a really good analogy. Is that, it's like playing a turn-based game where they get to make 3 turns while you make one, and that is one thing that I think, personally, what I think would have benefited Elden Ring is if they, instead of making all these combos and opportunities for boss attacks so plentiful, I think what they should have done is just increased the sort of speed at which the ratio sort of works, right? Like, this is one thing that you can kind of notice if you play the game sort of in chronological, not chronological, yeah, chronological order, right? Like if you play Demon Souls, then you play Dark Souls, then you play Dark Souls 2, then you play Bloodborne, then you play Dark Souls 3, then you play Sekiro, then you play Elden Ring, right? You will notice that the sort of beats per minute or pace of each fight gradually gets a little faster, right? Like the average fight gets a little faster in each game, or at the very least maintains a status quo, right? So for example, it's very noticeable in Bloodborne that the enemies are far more aggressive and faster than they are in the previous games up to that point. That doesn't mean there weren't fast enemies beforehand, but there are more fast enemies, and the attacks in general are faster in Bloodborne, right? Both in terms of the player character as well as the enemies and bosses, right? Then you look at Dark Souls 3, it continues that by making everything a little bit faster. Then you get Sekiro, which gets some very quick attacks from just a little bit I've played of it, right? Then you get Elden Ring, where you get this stuff, where there is just so many combos that come out so fast, the breathing room is tiny. What I think the ultimate problem is not necessarily the speed of the attacks on the bosses. It's the um, pace at which the dance happens, right? And the typical dance that I've mentioned in several streams and videos is that a good boss fight is a dance where you go back and forth with the boss, ideally trading blows, or dodging effectively and getting a little damage, and then they do like an attack, like a small combo or something like that, and then you do it again, right? The problem with this kind of philosophy that's introduced in Elden Ring, where they just make combos go on forever and they make enemies recover way too quickly, is that you are taking what is essentially built, like at its peak, this combat system works as a duet of two dancers. All right, think of it like that. On the one hand, you want both of the dancers to shine. You want both of them to have moments that can be effective in the dance overall. What Elden Ring has essentially done is taking one of the dancers and given them 3 times more moves, probably more if you actually broke down the ratio of attack openings to hit combos. But they've essentially taken one of the two dancers and given them far more dancing stuff to do, while the other dancer is just doing their normal thing, right? They've overclocked one of the dancers. And so it throws off the entire rhythm of the fight when you have the player character who can maybe get 1, maybe 2 hits in, depending on the enemy and depending on their AI, and then the enemy does their long combo or their big AoE move, that they instantly recover from. It's a very mixed bag of combos, right? Or not mixed bag of combos, but a mixed bag of abilities that don't have hardly the refresh time that justifies the amount of damage and the amount of combo hits within the combos that they dish out. To put it simply, they overclock the difficulty by just not giving the player openings where they really, really should. Right, like, and this is one thing that I think Margit and Morgott are the best examples of that done poorly, because they have so many combos that have so many extensions added to them that you don't really know where the openings are unless you've played the crap out of the boss, right? And it's one of those things where it's no longer about telegraphing an attack and paying attention as much as it is timing and just understanding the bullshit, right? It's a very similar sort of level of difficulty to a lot of encounters in Dark Souls 2 that have been particularly picked on, right? It's not about the actual fight itself as much as I am knowledgeable of the bullshit the game is using to fight me. So I'm going to do everything in my power to counter that somehow, right? Now, the difficulty in Dark Souls 2 is very different from the difficulty in Elden Ring, for vast majorities of sort of how things work. But what I would say is Elden Ring does a lot of the Soul series formula badly because it relies so much on the overstuffing of enemy abilities, right? Whether it be through massive combos with, massive combos, coupled with delayed attacks, coupled with different types of damage, coupled with range attacks, coupled with follow-up moves they can do depending on what the player is doing, right? It's essentially they've made the bosses so complicated with their combos and their reactions to what we do in the middle of those combos that we get to a point where the best option to deal with a combo is to simply run away from the fight. It is better to run away from most combos in the game than to try to dodge through all of them, wait for all of that combo to end, and then get your one attack in just to wait another 5 minutes while the next combo comes through and you go through it just to get your one hit in again. The hit to opening, like the combo to opening ratio, is drifting very badly in the boss's favor, and that's never been the strong suit in these games, right? And it's one of those things that I think makes fighting particular enemies incredibly frustrating, particularly Margit and Morgott, because of their combos and because of their follow-up combos that happen sort of irregularly, right? And it's one of those things where Elden Ring is sort of what, in my personal opinion, is sort of the peak of them trying to make it difficult but fair, but they're fucking up the fair part, right? It's just one of those things where just there are several combos that he mentioned actually in the Margit section where Margit has a lot of follow-up attacks that are somewhat randomized, it seems, or they're very indicative based on what the player's doing. So they're basically built to catch you out at certain points in his combo, right? And they do that with Morgott to a more excessive degree. And it's one of those things that I think does bog down this fight along with a lot of the other ones, is that you have all these bosses that have what could have been great move sets. The problem is that the big combos have a tiny window to recharge. Then they do it again. 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 And same thing with the big moves, right? There are so many times that I've dealt with bosses in this game where they do this big combo that not only does high damage, also can knock you on your ass, lasts a long time, and can also move the boss away from the player during it or at the end of it. So at the end of that entire combo, nothing is accomplished on the player's end besides taking damage, dodging, or maybe getting one hit in and trading damage rather than actually waiting for the combo to end and getting a hit in. There are too many moments where the boss does a ridiculous amount of things that are in its favor without leaving an opening for the player to punish. That's not to say that it's not in the game at all. There are definitely moments where the boss does a big thing and there's an opening. But a big problem is that several bosses have that stupid shit where they do a long combo, does a crazy amount of damage, and then they leap back. or they jump back, or they jump into the sky or something out of reach from you. It's incredibly annoying to deal with when you deal with this massive combo and you can't even use your opening afterwards to actually damage the boss. At this point, the developers are just wasting our time when we fight these bosses when they keep doing this shit. And it's really annoying. Really annoying.
I suspect that this, along with the myriad of delayed attacks, is what FromSoft had to resort to in order to keep the series difficult for veterans. They've had to put in absolutely overwhelming patterns for people who are used to dodging the comparatively simple stuff, but if you ask me, that really wasn't the way to go. The result is a game that's extremely defensive without any room to express yourself, even though there's more options than ever for building your character. They aren't included in this video, but Leonine Misbegotten, Godskin Noble, and Elemer of the Briar are all prime examples of enemies that attack way too frequently. What makes Morgott interesting is that he might be the only boss who manages to get away with all of this, because he has it all: the excessive combos, the delayed attacks, and the crazy mobility. The only reason that he not entirely, but kind of makes it work is because his numbers across the board are a lot lower. Each hit really doesn't do very much damage, either because they wanted it to be a fight about hit trading, or because it's made up for by how long and how often his attacks come out. It's probably a bit of both. For instance, his most ridiculous combo is one where he pulls out 3 different golden weapons. He swings his dagger around, then flails 2 swords in front of him, then spins around a bunch of times with a hammer before finishing with a final slam. I haven't been able to count an exact number, but I'm pretty sure this combo throws out at least 12 different hitboxes, and dodging through all of them has pretty strict timing, but you don't need to learn it, because you can just roll through it on a whim and stomach whatever hits manage to catch you. The same is true for his spin attacks, and even some of his more common combos. It's probably more worth your time to fight him this way, because odds are you'll be able to out-heal him as well. In addition to his low damage, he has relatively low health. I don't have footage of it anymore, but I distinctly remember my very first kill on him only taking about 2 minutes, and that includes the time it takes for him to change phases. To be clear, I don't think bringing down the numbers is the solution to other bosses that have equally aggressive behavior. In fact, it's mostly been the opposite. It hurts the enjoyment of Morgott on subsequent playthroughs because unless you go into the fight intentionally underleveled, you're probably going to steamroll him every time. He's still poorly balanced, just in the other direction. It gives you the advantage to make the fight less frustrating, but also too easy. Fortunately, there are still other redeeming qualities to help make Morgott fairly enjoyable. He has some distance closing moves that he can pull out whenever he's far away, which justifies his rather erratic mobility. For example, his somersault looking move will often put a lot of distance between you two, but his charging spear attack or the impaling thrust with his sword can rocket him in your direction after the fact, so there's less pointless waiting. Even if he doesn't attack, he can just walk back up to you sometimes to keep the action going. Fights like Renala and the Regal Ancestor were lacking this, which is why they were a lot more boring. Morgott has the right tools in his kit to prevent the pacing of the fight from being interrupted. Additionally, I think Morgott...
Kind of going on the pacing of the thing he just mentioned, I think there's a problem when you give bosses this level of mobility where they dodge back, but then they also have moves that make them dodge forward or give them an attack that they will pull out as soon as you try to do something, right? Like there are certain encounters with with this boss and several others, but with Melania is a good example, right? She has a move where she can dodge backward, but then while you try to do something during the open space, she can do her grab move or her thrust, which is very tightly timed, where if you try to do something, she will probably hit you. Like there's a pretty high chance of her hitting you, unless you just happen to get really lucky and she doesn't do the move, or you manage to time things frame by frame perfectly, right? But other bosses have that problem too, where they can dodge away from you and then immediately close the distance as well. So it's that thing where the boss has far higher mobility than the player, but then the boss also doesn't have any of the restrictions of having to wait in between those dashes, right? It's essentially they have get away from player button, get right back to player button. It's a thing that just makes the whole point of why are you making them so mobile if you're just going to make them go away and come back to me like anyway. It's a thing where I got to wonder, like, what's the point of giving, you know, us all of these abilities that have these windups if most of the time when we fight the bosses, they're going to be so aggressive and dodgy that they can counter the damage we're dealing, avoid the hits we're dealing, and then immediately get back up in our face during our recovery animation when they don't really have the same restrictions. And I've seen this comment pop up here and there that Elden Ring essentially has sort of Dark Souls 3 combat with Dark Souls 1 speed, right? Or that it's faster than Dark Souls 3, but our player character has like the speed of a Dark Souls 1 character. It's like the speed of the game versus the speed of the player character is off balance. And that creates a significant problem when it comes to fighting the bosses specifically, because it feels like they can just do so much shit that you can't really counteract other than running away, right? Or knowing, again, it's that thing of, knowing the bullshit is there helps you counteract the bullshit. But at the same time, having to know bullshit is there to deal with the bullshit doesn't mean that the bullshit isn't still bullshit.
Shows how boss reuse can be done well. I talked about this in my Elden Ring critique, so I won't repeat everything I said there, but even though he is the same character as Margit, he's gotten a very good moveset upgrade to keep the fight from being a carbon copy. I still like that many of Margit's moves return so that you can test your old muscle memory, but these moves don't make up the majority of his kit. There's a lot of new stuff that very much feels in the spirit of Margit without replicating him too much. Unfortunately, the fact that you can find regular Margit out in Altus Plateau before this partially ruins the surprise of Morgott showing up here, but purely from a moveset perspective, it's a very sensible upgrade. I just really wish he had more health so that his fight had more time to shine. It's always over before it has a chance to begin. At any rate, Morgott is the only boss in the game who I can say manages to be at least a little bit fun in spite of his excessive attack patterns. It can turn it into a hit trading fight, which is at least unique even if it's not super fun. Many bosses in the late game have behavior that follows in Morgott's footsteps, just without the low damage numbers, and they'll be a hell of a lot worse than him because of it.
This is one thing I noticed while he was playing, right? Is when let me go back to when he's got the mage build going. Yeah. See, here's the thing, right? He mentioned Morgott having too low health, but this is the thing, right? Is he's got Ronnie's gear and the Dark Moon sword and Ronnie's moon, right? Along with like a decently chunky health bar, right? If you break down how many levels he would have had to put to use Ronnie's Dark Moon, which I believe requires 69 or 72, one of those numbers, basically around 70 intelligence to use. Then you've got the sword, which requires a decent bit of dexterity, a decent bit of strength, as well as intelligence, right? Then you've got his health bar being where it is and his FP bar being where it is. You've essentially got what is upwards of probably 70 levels by the time he gets here, right? Now, I don't know how other people play the game, but if you do everything up to this point, which might be the intended route, I could see that being a thing. But this is the problem with Elden Ring, is that there's so much open space in between things that I'm not really sure what level you're actually supposed to be by the time you get to certain bosses. It's that weird thing where because you've made the game so open world, it's hard to judge when you're supposed to be like at a certain level when you get to certain bosses. I mean, obviously the end game stuff, they want you to be higher up there, but it is one of those weird things in terms of like it's hard to judge how tough enemies should be from like a health perspective.
I don't have a whole lot to say about Commander Nile other than that his fight has a solution that I don't really like. He summons a pair of adds at the beginning of the fight, one of which is the dual sword Banished Knight, who's one of the worst enemies in the game. Their spin attack has insane tracking and their combos are really long. It's not just bosses that are overtuned, it's also regular enemies like these. They were wise to make some adjustments to numbers and AI for this fight, since I'm pretty sure his adds have less health than they do as normal enemies, and if you kite them around the arena, Nile will mostly leave you alone to deal with them. I still really don't like the fight though. These obnoxious enemies distract a lot from Nile himself, and he would have been just fine if it remained a 1v1. It goes back to the
I fully agree with this, as well as for the other commander that we fight in Kayla. Just the summoning aspect of it is just like, dude, you are just throwing shit in this fight to make it harder. Please stop. Especially by this point, because by this point you've dealt with probably a good bit of the game's bullshit, right? Where they just add enemies, and this is one of those things where it's just like, can you please stop? Just like, please stop adding just extra stuff. Like, do we have to layer? Like, I think one of the biggest problems with Elden Ring's bosses is that they tend to have a lot of the same problems across the board, which makes all of them blend together after a while, right? When they all have big combos, when they all have big AoE moves, when they all have, different huge health pools. When you have like a lot of the same attacks, a lot of bosses blend together. I'm not saying every single boss in the game blends together when you compare absolutely all of them to all of each other, but a large portion of the boss fights feel very similar at certain points because they have essentially the same move set of, here's the long combo with delayed attacks involved. Here's the big AoE move that does absurd damage and is very hard to dodge. Here's the boss fights that summon or have multiple enemies in it to fuck with you. It's that thing where just they use the same tropes just over and over and over and over and over, and it gets tedious, especially by the time you're hitting here, where you're nearing the end game, or what you would consider the end game, right?
Valiant Gargoyles problem. These enemies don't complement each other, they were just an uninspired and failed attempt to make the fight more interesting. If you want to make the fight easier for yourself, you can use Bewitching Branches on the adds and turn them against the boss. It effectively makes them your own summons. This is probably the best way to fight him simply because it makes it less of a headache, but then it has the same problem that Spirit Ashes do. The fight becomes a joke since the AI isn't well suited for handling multiple targets. Plus, the Banished Knights are so busted that they can deal half of Nile's health without you having to do anything. There's no medium between laughably easy and ridiculously frustrating. Maybe the challenge is supposed to be realizing that Bewitching Branches are the solution, but if that's true, I would have liked to see some kind of hint or reminder that the item exists. With how many materials and consumables are in Elden Ring, it's easy to gloss over a lot of them, and Bewitching Branches fall into that category. I completely forgot they existed until I was reading about other people's experiences with the fight. It would also be easy to criticize the fight for encouraging the use of consumable items, but fortunately this isn't a major problem for Nile. There are enough Bewitching Branches available for purchase that you probably won't have to spend much time farming for them. I don't mind fights needing items as long as those items are easily replenishable, such as to eliminate grinding. As for Nile himself, he's just a very average enemy. His
This is one thing I disagree on. I think if the best way to deal with an encounter is to have specific items that you have to farm, I think you're just wasting the player's time. Because you can make a good fight that does not require A, searching for resources, B, grinding to make those resources, or C, you can just take out the thing that makes the fight radically easier, right? And it's one of those things where, on his own, I don't think this is a particularly bad boss, right? I think his damage numbers are a little too high. Like, I think he just does absurd damage with all of his elemental stuff. And I don't like the AoEs. But the summoning of the two dudes is what really gets this fight into the fuck you territory, right? It's like, if he was just on his own in this arena, I think it'd be a pretty decent fight, right? Not perfect, but pretty decent, right? But the summons put him in the fuck you territory because it's like, why are you summoning dudes in the middle of a boss fight just to make the game harder, just to make it more tedious because I have to deal with them before I deal with the boss, or I have to ignore them while dealing with the boss, right? You're just making the encounter more tedious by adding more elements that don't add to the dance of the player dealing with the boss. You just threw in two average dickheads, right? And it's one of those things where I don't care if you can make one of them friendly or both of them friendly to help you with the boss fight. That's still a problem. Just adding spam to the encounter doesn't make it better, even if you can turn the spam against the boss. If you can do that, why not just take out the spam to begin with and just have the player fight the boss mano a mano? Instead of showing that you can use items to blitz bosses or fuck with enemies or deal with the spam, or on the other hand, you just have just the boss deal with you like a regular boss would when it's just the two of you in an arena. Why is that a problem? Why is fighting a boss on their own a problem? Why do we have to add all this extra shit on top of it?
Moveset is a little small, and I don't like how delayed his flying kick is, and none of the problems with him get solved by throwing in a couple extra enemies. My guess is that his limited moveset is supposed to be compensated by the ads, which just isn't a very creative way of expanding on a boss. In short, Commander Nile is very unimaginative. It's a simple boss that had to be inflated by making it a gank fight, with a solution that isn't particularly satisfying to use. Among the quote-unquote side bosses, the ones at the end of smaller overworld dungeons like Castle Sol, he's definitely one of the least exciting.
Welcome, honored
Here we go.
guest,
Get to the big boys.
to the birthplace of our dynasty.
Moog is the boss who I've probably had the biggest shift in opinion on since my last Elden Ring video, and fortunately it's been for the better. His fight is very well paced despite the presence of several delayed combos. The thing with Moog is that pretty much all of his moves come out at least a little bit slower than you would expect, and the entire fight is defined by adapting to these unusual timings. It doesn't hurt Moog the way it hurts other bosses because 1, these delays usually look sensible with his animations, and 2, the entire fight maintains a slower tempo. Delayed attacks can create an inconsistent flow in other fights because they're specifically meant to throw you off. They force you to make some very jarring adjustments to your rhythm by coming out in the midst of more naturally timed attacks. For instance, after weaving through Morgoth's rapid dagger, sword, hammer flurry, he can suddenly shift to a 3-second wind-up stab. The transition between these moves doesn't feel very smooth. When you know that all of Moog's moves have these mild delays on them, you don't go through those sort of frustrating adjustments. You just have to train yourself to do every dodge a half second to a full second later than you're used to. Once you settle into that rhythm, you don't have to worry about being unexpectedly ripped out of it. Moog respects that you've learned his timings and just wants to put that to the test as much as possible. There are still a few things that you could criticize him for, with the most pressing one in my opinion being his transition to Phase 2. This is an instance of literal unavoidable damage. When going
This is one of those things that I've previously mentioned on my item rant. If you have to have an item to deal with the boss's bullshit, just remove the bullshit. Just remove the bullshit. It's like if you have to use stuff outside of the boss arena to deal with, like if you have to use like items that aren't a part of your build to deal with the boss, I think that you are inherently limiting the functionality of the player during the boss fight, as well as just adding to the boss fight in a negative way because of requirements that have to be met for the encounter to be more fair, right? And this is one thing. Like I think Moog's biggest problem is his blood stuff. Like I don't think his moveset is actually a problem. It's just that he sprays the blood shit everywhere and it lingers for a long time on top of this blood stacking. Right? It's one of those things that I think now granted he is the Lord of Blood, so he should have blood stuff, but this is excessive, right? This is just excessive blood bullshit. Right? Like if he had like if he threw blood everywhere like he does, and it did not linger, and this effect just boosted his damage against you, I could be persuaded to think that it's okay, right? Because depending on how they balance it, but it is one of those things where because they apply this weird blood ritual thing to you, and then have him spray blood everywhere that lingers and applies blood whenever you or applies bleed when you stand in it, you're just making the blood boss the most stereotypical version of the blood boss with move sets that just do the same shit over and over and over rather than making it a dynamic fight, right? It's one of those things where I feel like a lot of things in Elden Ring could have been better if they just went with a less is more approach. And I think Moog's a really good example of if they took out the lingering blood effects and this stacking blood thing he does, I think he'd be a pretty decent fight, all things considered. But it's one of those things where we're comparing that version of Moog to what we get now, which is also compared to all the other bosses in the game that we have now that are ridiculously fast and aggressive and everything else. So it's one of those things where if we rebalance the game, made everything a little bit slower, I think he would actually stand out as a pretty good boss fight. Not the best, but I think a pretty good boss fight overall.
Going into Phase 2, Moog will apply blood loss on you 3 times and there's nothing you can do to stop it. However, the damage can be heavily mitigated by drinking one of the wondrous physic tears that you acquire from doing Yura's questline. At a certain point, there's an NPC invader at a church in Altus who will drop it for you. Honestly, it's not so much the unavoidable damage part that's bothersome as it is the weirdly obscure item you're supposed to use.
Yeah,
Mitigating the damage simply isn't very intuitive. Missing out on quest lines is pretty easy in this game, and if you didn't happen to progress Euros far enough before this point, I'm not sure how you're expected to work out the solution. Nothing about Yura suggests a connection to Moog, and I can imagine the frustration someone playing blind will experience when they come across this attack and just assume that you need to chug a bunch of health flasks to deal with it. I was lucky to have found the tier naturally on my first playthrough, but it's still not a very good gimmick. Another fair criticism would be that he exposes problems with the game's buffer system. This is not exclusive to Moog, but I was waiting until now to talk about it because I find that he and Radagon are where it punishes you the most. Simply put, Elden Ring buffers your roll inputs for way too long. If you mistime your dodge by the tiniest amount, it will still often queue up your input and make you roll as soon as you're freed from hit stun.
yeah, that is a significant problem. This is really a significant problem all the games have had, but I have noticed it especially in Elden Ring. Maybe it's because you have to dodge roll a lot more in this game just by comparison. But there are significant issues with combos where the roll catching that will happen is almost perfectly timed with the fact that if you try to roll, fuck it up, but the lingering effect of the game trying to make you roll as soon as possible, that will only screw you up even more, right? What mechanically should be happening is you hit roll a little early. What you should do is what the game should register that if you hit the roll button and you cannot roll, the game should not make you roll. That's just how I view it, right? The mechanic should not linger and try to do it as soon as possible, right? And I've also had this problem when it comes to heavy attacks with weapons, where I will go to have one heavy strike. I will click my attack button, which I'm a PC player, so I will do my heavy attack once, and then out of nowhere, my character will randomly do a follow up attack when I actively did not press anything to make them do that. It's just that thing where the game is not doing what I am telling it to do, which makes it feel unfair, and which often leads to significant increase of damage or death. Oftentimes because the game is just fucking stupid when it comes to your inputs, right? And this isn't a problem of mistiming, right? This isn't a problem of mistiming an attack or double clicking when I should have single clicked or something like that. This is the game actively taking your inputs and doing them at the worst possible moment in ways that should not be the normal way the buttons work. Right? Like if you try to dodge a combo and you hit dodge and you begin the dodge, but then you mistimed it and you get hit anyway, right? You should not follow that up immediately with another dodge, right? The game should not make you auto dodge if you're spamming roll before an attack comes through. But if you gain control of your character and you're not hitting roll, you should not roll anyway because of the lingering effect of the roll, right? It's just one of those things that's just a stupid mechanic that they have never fixed in this series. And I don't really understand how it works mechanically. Like, how do you make a system like this where the rolling animation begins as soon as possible based on you hitting the button when you can't actually roll during the input of the button? Like, it's just a confusing mechanic, and I have no idea why they have it still in this game. Right? This has been prevalent since Demon Souls, the original version, in 2009. It's been like almost 16 years. How have you not figured this shit out? Right? You can make all this shit in the game, but you can't figure out how to fix the delayed rolling problem. At this point, I think they leave it in because they know it'll catch players out. At this point, I think they don't care, and that's the problem. Is they don't care about the player experience in having the mechanics work consistently as much as just make the fight harder by any means necessary. If there's a bug in the way that our rolling system works, fuck it, fuck the player. It's a very anti-player thing to leave in after so many games. Like, I don't understand how this could be so hard to fix over a decade.
Even though you only pressed the button once. This is one of my biggest complaints about the combat system, and it's frankly asinine to me that they thought the buffer being this large was okay. Many attacks are specifically timed to punish incorrect rolls, which means that failing one dodge will often lead you into getting punished twice. You'll get hit for pressing the button too late, which is fair, but then you'll roll right into another attack afterwards and take another hit that you didn't deserve. The buffer has existed in all the games before this, but it's never been this unnecessarily punishing. Buffer systems are very helpful when you have to execute highly complex inputs. That's why they're a core mechanic in fighting games, but Elden Ring is not at all like that. There's no reason for it to be as long as it is. It's a very noticeable issue with Moog because his attacks look a lot slower, so when you watch your character dive straight into another attack after your mistake, it's like watching a car crash in slow motion. It'll look like there should have been plenty of time for the buffer to clear, but it still doesn't. Lastly, you could argue that the Bloodfire pools in Phase 2 are his indicator of bloated design. I previously criticized them for limiting your engagement opportunities too much and trapping you into unsafe dodges. I mostly take back what I said though. These moves emphasize positioning and careful play better than other similar attacks do. You want to stay relatively close to Moog so that his Bloodfire flies over you. If you get cold feet and try to back off, that's when you'll get punished. The fire tends to accumulate behind you, so rolling away from him usually isn't safe. You need to stay confident and trust that it'll miss you. The truth is, Moog's attacks are well balanced for that approach so that he rarely forces you into a risky position with these arena hazards. It seems like the AI knows which moves to chain together and which ones not to, so that you always have a safe option when dodging. Moreover, the Bloodfire pool durations are properly tuned to work with his moveset. They will disappear when you need them to disappear, and he doesn't attack so relentlessly that he'll cover all of your space. Even though it may not feel like it at first, you're always given the proper leeway that you need. It is true that sometimes he'll stand on top of it in a way that makes melee engagement impossible, and I don't really like those moments, but they make up a very small portion of the fight. The key is to not
This is a point where I would largely disagree. I think that they do hinder gameplay significantly when you essentially have a boss trapping you in a particular part of the map and then running to attack you after a while. I think there are too many negatives versus the positives of a new move to dodge. I think there are too many negatives in terms of having limited positioning without application of bleed, on top of certain builds not being able to emphasize the usefulness of their builds, right? Like Moog spraying blood everywhere from range means that a lot of the caster builds that have range, or really just any range build for that matter, whether you use a bow or a spell, they're going to inherently have less opportunities to use the things their builds are built for, right? And on the melee end, he will throw bleed everywhere, and then if he does his little like jump up, fly through, and lunge thing, he will go into an area that's probably covered with blood anyway, and so you'll just have to wait until he gets out of it, right? It's that thing where Moog is obviously a slower paced fight, all things considered, but given that, I think some of the delays in sort of dealing with the blood stuff in phase 2, I think is still problematic. While it's not as problematic as some other boss moves that we'll probably get to later, I do think that Moog's phase 2 with the lingering blood stuff is probably a little overtuned. I would either have them linger less time, or I would have him spurt them out fewer times. Like I think we need to lower something somewhere, right? And at that point, it just comes down to balancing. But I think that I would disagree with VG Matthew here. I think the blood spew stuff is very annoying and only delays certain things, while also punishing different builds depending on what you're trying to do.
let impatience get the better of you. That's the trap that I fell into. Trying to find shortcuts to circumvent the fire just isn't an option. You have to play Moog's game. Once that clicks with you, you'll hopefully find that Moog's game is actually pretty fun.
This is one thing, like him saying Moog's game. I think that's essentially what you could say about every single boss fight. Is you have to play the boss's game. It's just a lot of times the boss game adds a lot of extra tedium that didn't need to be there to begin with. And I think Moog's no exception to that. Granted, I think his overall moveset is a little bit tighter than some of the other bosses in the game, but at the same time, it is one of those things where just it's the blood spewing makes all the rest of his combos far more dangerous because now you have to figure out how to dodge them while also dealing with bleed proc. You know, like if it does happen.
As clear as day.
Let's see what's up next. The fire giant, yay! Tedium in a nutshell.
Elden Ring's endgame has been very frequently criticized for the enemies having way too much health and dealing way too much damage.
Yes.
Mountaintops of the Giants and the consecrated snowfield easily exhibit the most balance issues out of any area in the game, and for proof of that, you need look no further than the fire giant.
Hard agree. Hard agree. Fire Giant's probably the worst boss in terms of damage dealing, tedium, and massive health pool, just wasting our time. Shit. I hate Fire Giant. The more I fight him, the more I hate him. He might be one of the worst fights in the game. I don't think he's the worst, but he is definitely one of those fights that is just, it's purely spectacle. Mechanically, it is busted. It is just fucking stupid and boring.
This is yet another tedious fight that's prolonged by empty time where you often need to close distance and dodge attacks by just running around. That's about all Torrent is good for when it comes to combat, so it's nice that he's available, but that doesn't make fighting on horseback any more enjoyable. Lots of the Giant's wide-reaching attacks don't even feel dodgeable on Torrent. The lack of iframes really stings here. I've only been able to dodge some moves by mounting and dismounting at the right time, which isn't very intuitive or smooth. He's also easily the biggest boss in the game, so naturally the camera is going to cause problems. It's the most frustrating with him because his attacks will always be coming out off screen. The frame can barely fit in a single foot, but his attacks come out from his hands, his stomach, basically everywhere that you can't see. With Estelle and Fortisax, you could at least notice their bodies shifting or use sound cues to get a feel for what's going on. The Fire Giant doesn't have anything to justify his gargantuan size other than the spectacle, which by now isn't a good enough reason. A colossal HP bar combined with very high damaging attacks doesn't do him any favors either. Chipping away at him gets extremely tiring, and that progress can very easily be ripped away if you make some small slip-ups and die in just 1 or 2 hits.
Yep, that's another problem with just yeah, like this is the problem with the Fire Giant shows a lot of different problems when you layer on all these different mechanical choices, right? Mounted combat sucks. So fighting him on a mount during combat can suck when you get comboed like that, where there's no chance of escape. As soon as you get hit by one attack, the follow-up will probably kill you. Unless you just have absurd defenses or ultra high health, you're probably going to get two-hit comboed if you get hit while on torrent, or even if you get knocked off torrent, right? It's one of those fights that becomes very tedious given how he's got extremely high damage, combos that can stun you to death, giant AoE moves that can also multi-tap you at different points. Then you have mounted combat sucking, which means that you can get stun locked on your mount with no hope of escape. And then you've got the problem with his massive health pool and his rolling around, which are massive hitboxes that, again, deter mounted combat because mounted combat sucks in general, as well as dealing absurd damage that feels, like how am I supposed to dodge through a giant rolling over my tiny little person? Like, it's just a thing where just he is a perfect encapsulation of a lot of the problems with the game, specifically with the game regarding mounted combat and how fucked it is when you deal with enemies this big.
Giving enemies so much health can be a good thing if the fight is meant to test your mental stamina. Even Moog kind of did this, since he heals most of his health when transitioning to phase 2, and it worked well in that fight because you don't get instantly chunked when you take a single hit. The Fire Giant, on the other hand, is extremely unforgiving since his attacks do so much damage, which is really counterproductive if the intention is to make the fight an endurance test.
This is one problem too. I think Fire Giant's way too fast. I think if his attacks were slower, a la like the Adjudicator or something, like actually the Adjudicator is a really good comparison. When you have these massive enemies with a very clear weak point, I think you should play on that, right? I think the Fire Giant is just too fast. And I think his weak point should have been used more. I think he should have had a weak leg in phase 1 and then maybe like a weak hand in phase 2 that is hit because he is a slow attacker. The problem with this is the problem. In phase 1, you're largely going for the weak leg, right? Because it's obvious that it's a weak leg. It looks rotten, right? It looks like it's falling apart. So you hit that and it's a weak point, right? In phase 2, like his weakest points, I believe, are his hands, but they're so hard to hit because he's moving them around all the damn time. So you usually end up just slapping his crotch or his ass. Like you're not actually going for the weak point because the weak point is flailing around all the time because he's so fast with how he attacks. Whereas it could have been much better, if they just made him have a different weak point, or made him slower but harder hitting. This is one of those things where I actually think that Placidusax could have been a good influence on this boss in particular, because Placidusax has a lot of AoE moves, but a lot of them are very manageable to deal with because the boss himself is not moving. It's the AoEs that are dealing the damage, right? It's that thing where, the boss doesn't move a lot in phase 1, but the AoEs are the things that are the sort of challenge, right? I think the Fire Giant would have been a good fight if they expanded that to the entire Fire Giant fight, where he does a lot of AoE moves. They're very slow, but they do a lot of damage, right? That would be balancing, right? Having a big AoE that does a lot of damage, but it's got a long wind up and long telegraphing, right? That would be a good balancing choice. When you make him fast along with high damage and high mobility, you're just making this take forever to deal with. Especially when I have to essentially make all the right decisions consistently. Otherwise, I'm going to get comboed to death if I'm on Torrent trying to catch up, where I have to figure out ways to dodge attacks while I run at the boss when he's, 50 meters away. You're just making the encounter more tedious when you keep stacking all this shit.
It's naturally more likely that the player will make mistakes the longer a fight lasts, because there's more time to mess up, and if the boss is to recognize this, I think it's much wiser to only kill you if lots of little mistakes build up over time instead of giving them a chance to kill you over a single blunder. The further you get into the fight, the more frustrating you'll feel if and when you mess up. Dying when he's at 10 or 20% HP is extremely discouraging since it takes so long to redo all of that progress. This boss needs a much better balance of letting the player make mistakes while still preserving the challenge of being a drawn-out fight. I think his worst attack is when he starts summoning large fireballs that track you for a really long time before exploding. The best way to avoid them is just to stay out of reach and drag them around until the explosion is out of the way. You always have to be very alert to these because they tend to explode off-screen if you're not paying attention. The fire that lingers on the ground afterwards can stun-lock you and leave you stuck underneath the giant's body if you aren't vigilant. It's another good example of a move that disrupts the fight's pacing. If you're trying to attack the giant when one of these fireballs comes out, you have to run away to safety before you can continue. I could sit here and nitpick the rest of his moveset because honestly, all of his attacks are problematic in some capacity, but it isn't worth the time. His numbers are the main issue. His size and moveset don't lend itself well to such a drawn-out fight. As the boss of the mountaintops, I guess he's fitting in a sort of twisted way. It's like the ultimate metaphor for everything wrong with Elden Ring's endgame. Bloated HP bars, terribly unforgiving damage, lots of empty time, and most important of all, he proved to be way too big for his own good.
That is a very apt comparison between the game and him as a whole.
Even though she isn't super remarkable, Loretta is probably my favorite boss in the game. She's great for many of the same reasons as Godric. She's a nicely refined encounter without any excessive mechanics tacked on to inflate her difficulty. My main complaint is less to do with her mechanics and more the fact that she's another recycled fight. There's lots of time between this and the Korea Manor version, so the frequency isn't as bad, but it is kind of an anticlimactic boss given the area. Putting that aside, the most refreshing thing about Loretta is that she has very few delayed attacks. Her moves look and behave a lot more naturally, which is an important reminder that relying on instinct for fights can still be very fun. It feels like FromSoft forgot that not every single boss needs their own gimmicky curveball to make them harder. Loretta does nothing of the sort. It's a very back-to-the-basics test, which ironically makes it stand out in the sea of overtuned fights. She also doesn't attack with the same ridiculous frequency that Morgott or Malekith do. Even with a heavy weapon, there's adequate time to punish her, and it's always pretty clear when those opportunities arise. Like many bosses, staying in melee range is a pretty safe bet. You can iframe through many of her spear attacks, and her patterns remain consistent throughout, so whenever she starts a combo, you know what to expect. You know that it's not going to lead into any unexpected surprises. Allowing for these openings makes Loretta a whole lot more fun to return to on subsequent playthroughs. There's a higher skill cap on her compared to things like Margit and Rykard. Once you get more comfortable with the fight, you'll become more keenly aware of openings that you hadn't noticed before. It might feel like Loretta attacks too much initially, but everything she does is consistent and telegraphed. At a certain point, her behavior becomes much more predictable, which you can exploit once you've gotten better at the fight. It's things like this that make improving at the game worthwhile, and it's disappointing that so few bosses give that opportunity. There's not many fights in Elden Ring that I look forward to returning to, but she is one of them. The only move of hers that really bothers me is her magic lance spin in Phase 2 since she hangs in the air for so long. It's the only exception to the delayed attack praise I was giving earlier. It just looks a bit silly and feels very at odds with the rest of her moveset. That aside, there's not a whole lot to complain about here. Loretta shows the power of simplicity. She doesn't feel the need to rise above and prove herself. They were content with making her a relatively standard Souls boss that ticks all the right boxes. It would be hard to argue that she's one of the greatest bosses to have ever graced the series because she doesn't have the sort of wow factor that the best of the best do, but within Elden Ring, she sits in a very comfortable place.
This is one thing I'd say about her, actually. Now that he's brought it up, I actually kind of agree with him. You know, it's one of those things where, like, whenever I fight this enemy, my problem doesn't usually come from her actual move set. It's usually about the damage of her Loretta's mastery spell cast and the other sniping spell cast. It's like I feel like her number, like the numbers for those two abilities, are cranked as high as possible to kill the player. I'm pretty sure with the right armor, you can avoid a complete one shot, but it is one of those things where it feels like it's going to one shot most people. Um, and it's one of those things where, apart from that, I don't really have any problems with the fight overall. But it is one of those weird things that after him explaining how this is kind of a classic sort of boss, she went up a few pegs after he explained it to me, and I was kind of like, yeah, it's like, yeah, it is true. She is pretty good, all things considered. Oh, here we go. Now we get to the big one, to the meme one. Let's get to the meme one.
I am Melania, Blade of Mikola.
Melania has garnered the most infamy in the Elden Ring community, and rightfully so in my opinion, so there's not much I can say about her that you haven't heard already. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that there's one boss that I haven't beaten without summons, and she is that boss. I cannot beat Melania solo, and if that makes me bad at the game, then fine, I'm bad at the game. I've wasted too much time putting up with Waterfowl Dance to care anymore.
I think that little bit, that just the bit we've heard so far, I think is a perfect encapsulation of why people don't like her, right? Waterfowl is her most broken move. And I think that move drags down the entire fight, right? It does way too much damage, goes on for way too long, and heals her for an absurd amount of health. Everything else is manageable to a certain degree. But Waterfowl, man, it's the boss move that you go, okay, uninstall. That of all the moves in the game, that is probably the single most annoying move in the game. Now, I have to compare that to DLC moves. I have to rethink that over. I think another one might be Radon 2.0's grab, but you do have to get hit by that twice for that to become a problem. But of any sort of move that is a single cast type of thing, I think Waterfowl is essentially the worst move in the game for how unfair it is for the player. But anyway, let's and this is one thing, him giving up on her and using a summon, I think is totally fair given how much bullshit you have to put up with in the fight regarding Waterfowl.
I think the most tragic thing about her is that she's very, very close to being great. There's good ideas in this fight that are ruined by Elden Ring's habit of not knowing when to stop and say that enough is enough.
Again, completely agree with that. I've said it several times. If they tweaked a few things with the Melania fight, I think she'd be the best boss they've ever made. But she's dragged down drastically by just a couple little things, namely waterfowl being overpowered and the self healing. Those two things, and the input reading that all the bosses suffer from in this game. I know it's not technically input reading for those people in the comments. Actually, that's not the correct term. It's like, you know what I mean. Or better yet, let me say it this way: auto reactions. Let's just say it like that, where as soon as the player does something, the boss does the move that is supposed to counter it.
For example, she's another overly aggressive enemy that can unleash ridiculously long combo strings before giving you a turn, but it's actually almost fun on Melania because she can be quite vulnerable to hit stun, which is a very good idea when giving players an option to counter her behavior directly. Allowing the player to knock Melania out of her combos can go a long way in fostering aggression, and it can actually happen sometimes during the fight. I've tried playing hyper offensively against her before, and when that works in your favor, it's such a foreign feeling because you're finally being rewarded for taking the initiative. It takes me back to some of the best hunter fights in Bloodborne, where the pace never slowed down and you were always having meaningful interactions with the enemy. Unfortunately, this is not a consistently viable approach, and playing aggressive against her is just as risky as against any other boss, for two reasons. The first is that some of her moves have hyper armor, and there's a chance she can initiate one while you're in the middle of an engagement. So really, she can only be put into hit stun sometimes, and you can't reliably predict when those times are because her attacks come out so fast. If you're mid-attack animation when she gets hyper armor, there's not enough time to exit that animation and roll away afterwards. The second reason is because of Waterfowl Dance, because of course it is. When you get her HP into Waterfowl territory, staying near her for an extended period is no longer safe, whether that's in neutral or when you're trying to attack her. If you're trying to hit stun her when this move comes out, you are super screwed because dodging Waterfowl from up close is just miserable. You're risking way too much damage for it to be worth it. This is such a shame because otherwise she has all of the mechanisms to make relying on hitstun feasible. She can free herself by backing off to prevent that strategy from being too spammable, and she still uses several gap closers to prevent that from creating excessive dead time. Additionally, it would really help turn her into a fight that you have to master through confidence. I'll reference this game again because I think it's a great comparison. To those that have played a lot of Bloodborne, the evolution of fighting her could have felt like fighting Father Gascon. When you encounter him for the first time, you're more inclined to be defensive and avoid damage through dodging because he seems so relentless, but as time goes on, you'll realize that he can be stunned and comboed just as easily as you can. Instead of dodging his moves, you can just suppress them entirely, and the boss progresses from this passive engagement where you were too nervous to fight back into a bloodbath where you can become the dominant force and overpower him. It's a fight that inspires confidence. Melania never passes that passive stage, even though she had the potential to. You always have to hesitate before trying to attack her because there's a chance she'll just armor through whatever you're doing, and I really do think that she could have been one of the game's best fights if her poise didn't work this way. The other mechanic worth talking about with her is the lifesteal. I think this would have been fine, if not a little gimmicky, because yet again it can encourage aggressive play. Players would be less inclined to try dodging through her moves if messing up meant giving her additional health. It goes back to that Gascon approach I was just talking about. It might be easier to just keep wailing on her to prevent those opportunities in the first place. That would require her hyper armor issues to be resolved first though. Instead of that, I suspect the intention was to discourage the use of spirit ashes, which for the purposes of creating an ultra-hard super boss I can appreciate. Summons are naturally much worse at dodging than humans are, so when combined with her attack frequency, they could just become a free healing source for Melania. I don't really think this worked out in practice because if you get lucky, the two of you can just outdamage her lifesteal, but the idea is good, it just needed better execution.
I mean, and I know he's talking about like life still specifically there, but I think a lot of things with Melania, if they were ironed out and rebalanced a little bit, again, I think she'd be the best boss they ever made. And I think that is something that is kind of emblematic of the tragedy of Elden Ring, right? Like it had all of this learning sort of from all the previous games, right? All the Souls games, Bloodborne, Sekiro, it had all this knowledge to work off of, and they just decided to overstuff every single boss with the most tedious shit to deal with them, right? Because it's one of those things where if you rebalance one aspect of Melania's fight, right, whether it be the hyper armor, whether it be the health steal, whether it be waterfowl, if you change one of those things, just one, the fight will drastically improve, right? Like if you get rid of her hyper armor and you're able to stun lock her out of waterfowl, that negates all the bullshit of waterfowl if you play aggressively, which the game is encouraging you to do given how she restores health with every hit, right? It's that thing where changing just one aspect of this fight can actually add to this fight in a massive way. The problem is they just continue to overclock her, but in different ways from the other bosses. Hello, sheep. How's it going? Tail wags. Excited to see our Vanger bear. Thank you. I'm glad you're here. So yeah, short thing. I'm trying to get through this video as fast as I can because I've got about an hour and a half to get through the rest of this video, which is 40 minutes. So we'll see how we're doing. So far, I've really enjoyed this video. I agree with most of his points. A couple disagreements, but you can rewatch the stream to see what I was dealing with. But we're about halfway through Melania, and he's gone over waterfowl being stupid, her hyper armor being stupid, and the self healing being overclocked. So we're pretty much on the same page as far as Melania being OP. So anyway, let's continue.
That being said, the fact that she still heals on blocked hits is complete nonsense. Again,
agreed. Fuck that shit. Because you want to leave us quickly, you can say it. Well, I have to. I have a previous engagement that I have to get ready for. And believe me, I am stretching this thin, trying to get this done as soon as possible. So just bear with me here. I'm trying. Okay, I'm trying.
Again, maybe they did this to discourage being defensive, but as I've hopefully established, the boss doesn't accommodate offensive play either, so I don't really get what shield users are supposed to do. It's very weird that such a specific playstyle is completely invalidated, and it should be common sense that if you don't deal damage, you don't get lifesteal. It's a decision that just goes way over my head. What's stopping her from running up to the wall and smacking it a few times to heal too? The concept is equally ridiculous.
That's a really good example, actually, of how stupid her healing through block is. I mean, her health steal really should be just a percentage of damage dealt is returned to her, right? So if you block, that shouldn't heal her. Now, if you have a shield that doesn't block 100% of damage, maybe she gets a percentage of the damage actually dealt through that. But still, just health restore in general from hitting like a piece of metal, right? It's just stupid. Yeah, I found myself almost completely agreeing with this guy. He knows what he's talking about. It's good. It's good that Elden Ring has sort of fostered a sort of Elden Ring's success, I think, has led to more criticism of From Software's stuff than a lot of the other games, just because Elden Ring has a lot of unique problems that they need to solve moving forward. This is kind of the turning point for the studio where they can either choose to fix these problems and continue to have a large audience that will enjoy their games, or they're going to continue down this road of games that are just overstuffed to fuck, and they're going to lose a significant portion of their audience. At this point, I don't think they're going to lose half of it or even a quarter, right? But I think a lot of the old school players like myself are going to turn away because we just don't want to deal with this shit anymore. I don't want to get good by dealing with bullshit. I want to get good because the boss is fair, gives me openings, and the fights are dances, not just a tedious runaway fest until I can actually have an opening.
These issues could have been fixed and turned into a wonderful fight if Melania was in any other game besides Elden Ring. It's very hard to imagine them creating her in the same overtuned fashion if she was made for Bloodborne or Dark Souls 3. Lady Maria and Sister Frida are both pretty good foils to see how Melania's battle could have been executed much better. A Melania critique wouldn't be complete without talking about Waterfowl Dance, but this move has already been discussed to death, and I don't want to let it distract too heavily from the other issues that the boss is faced with. I'm very firmly in the camp that Waterfowl Dance is a terrible move, but instead of continuing on this tirade for another 10 minutes, I'd just like to quickly address some of the rebuttals to criticisms that I and many others have thrown at it. Namely, the idea that it's too hard to dodge. When one brings that up, there seem to be three common arguments made in defense of Waterfowl Dance. Use Bloodhound Step to avoid it easily, use a freezing pot during the startup, or just get good and learn, since dodging it is technically possible at any distance. The problem with the Bloodhound Step argument is that it invalidates build choices. There's dozens upon dozens of Ashes of War in Elden Ring, and I don't think it's fair for a fight to funnel players into using the same single one to overcome it. I know accommodating every build 100% equally is basically impossible with how many there are, but that doesn't mean one option should be so blatantly encouraged over literally every other one. No other fight demands such a specific playstyle, and for good reason. As for the freezing pot, it's a good example of how not.
This is one thing though, is like those criticisms of the criticism of Millennia are very apt at showing that look, there are ways around it. It's like our problem isn't that we can't get around it in general. The problem is that it's the way it is, right? It's one of those things that if you have this specific item or this specific type of spell or this specific type of like Ash of War, then you can deal with it. It's like, okay, so you want me to change my build or farm items to deal with the boss's bullshit instead of having the boss be able to be like dealable like with the bullshit immediately, right? And it is one of those things you can dodge through waterfowl. I've done it a few times. You know, it is possible, but how the hell are you going to learn that on your own? Like legitimately, how the hell are you going to learn that? Because you have a 95% chance of dying to waterfowl if you try to dodge through it, right? If you try to dodge through it, you have a high chance of death. And until you learn the exact positioning and timing of those dodges, you're probably going to die each and every time, right? So unless you go into the fight just to trigger waterfowl and practice, you're going to get fucked, right? And that is a problem. That is a problem when a boss has one move that can totally fuck the player over unless they have very, very specific knowledge. This is part of the reason why Bed of Chaos is so annoying, is because it requires very specific knowledge of how to deal with the boss to counteract the bullshit in the fight. This is no different. Waterfowl has an absurd amount of things going against the player. It is the kill move of Millennia, right? It is absolutely the kill move of the game, practically. It is blatantly overpowered. It is blatantly ridiculous to deal with. And the only reason people are defending it is because they think we've not gotten good. It's like we have gotten good. And we have found the boss wanting. The boss is ridiculously overclocked with that move because the move is ridiculously overclocked. One, Bloodhound Step should never overshadow the base mechanic of rolling, and as he said, it invalidates your build. Yep, fully agree. Freezing Pots, you have to farm every time you lose. She gains more resistance to frost each time it procs. She can use it repeatedly. That's also true. I've had a specific... Now, I don't know if Elden Ring does this. I know in Dark Souls 3, if you applied frost, you could negate the frost by hitting them with a fire attack of some kind, whether it be a weapon or a torch or like a spell or a pyromancy. But I've got footage in one of my runs where Millennia did waterfowl, did one combo, and then waterfowl came back. So there is a possibility that she can do waterfowl chained together, or at the very least chained very close together. So that kind of invalidates a lot of the freezing pot thing when it doesn't have time to fade out. You know, it's just one of those things where just this boss is ridiculous, and it's that move that makes it ridiculous. Getting good for a move that forces you to dodge in absurd directions, use a lock off exploit is an obscene ask for a player. Yeah, well, it's one of those things where dealing with the boss's bullshit by using your own bullshit doesn't fix the problem. You're just adding more shit to the shit pile. I've used that metaphor many times. I should make a t-shirt out of it. Don't add shit to the shit pile. It just makes more shit. You know, but it is one of those things. Just waterfowl is that move. It's just the move that just destroys Millennia. Like, and again, I mentioned this earlier in the stream. I forget if you were here, Sheep. Excuse me. But I would say that Millennia, as a boss fight, if they rebalanced her hyper armor, rebalanced waterfowl, and readjusted the health steal, I think she'd be the best boss they ever made. Best boss they ever made. But the problem is they overclocked everything. So here we are.
Not to incorporate consumables into a fight. You'll die on Millennia a lot, and if you used a freezing pot for every single waterfowl, you'll probably spend more time grinding for them than actually fighting the boss. Enemies also build up status resistance the more you proc them. It's just not reliable to do this for every time she uses the move. As for the age-old get good response, the margin of error for dodging it normally is simply too small, especially when you have to dodge up close. Not only that, but dodging at that close distance entails doing a really weird circle around her so that she misses you. There's no footage of me doing it because I've never been able to, but either way, it isn't an intuitive method at all, and I don't see how you're supposed to naturally infer such a silly, specific response. The easy way to surmise this is that dodging it normally is too hard, even for a Soulsborne game. It takes way too long to learn how to consistently avoid all the damage, and by that point, I imagine most players are just begging for the boss to be over with, because spending so much energy to learn the response to a single attack just isn't fun. That's all I want to say about Waterfowl Dance. I hate the move, I hate Melania, I've bashed my head against this fight for so long that I'm sick of even talking about it. She's exhausted me to the point where I just don't care for her. For being the game's capstone challenge, she is such a major letdown, and I will always remember Melania as the only boss in FromSoft history that's defeated me.
That is kind of an interesting. His opinions after this game for the DLC, I think, would be interesting. But as I did promise, I'm not covering any more Elden Ring stuff after this. But I don't know. But it is one of those things where just like her being like her being the biggest marketing ploy, not the marketing, like her being so focused on in the marketing for the game, I think is very telling. Because they marketed a side boss that they intentionally overclocked with ridiculous moves instead of focusing on, you know, an actual main boss, that's actually relevant for the overall narrative or for actual completion of the story. It's very telling that they put a, side boss as they knew how the community would take this boss. They knew it. And one last thing about Waterfowl, having a boss that has a difficult move set is not a problem. Having a boss that has one move that is the kill move is the problem. When this move is so overclocked that it has a extremely high chance of killing the player while also radically delaying the fight because of how much damage is going to be turned into health for the boss, you've essentially given the boss a get out of jail free card that the player has about half a second to light on fire and hope it burns out before she cashes it in. It's one of those moves that I think radically breaks the fight with how overpowered it is. For the longest time, I just used Blasphemous Blade before its nerf to knock her down so she couldn't get a chance to waterfowl. Yeah, I'd always spam. Like I would pick anything with Destined Death on it. I would get Taish fully upgraded, and then I'd use the Malekith's sword weapon art and just use that Ash of War and just Destined Death her down as fast as possible. I don't even think he played the DLC, LeMayo. He may have been smart and just avoided it. Well, he's one step smarter than me. Can't believe I paid for that shit. Anyway, let's move on. We're getting to some more stuff now. Let's hope I can make it through this. I gotta pee. Let's see if I can wait for 36 minutes.
Among the bosses in Farum Azula and beyond, Dragonlord Placidusax is easily my favorite. There's a few fights in the series that don't have anything gimmicky about them, yet they still manage to meet and often exceed the presentation and spectacle of the actual gimmick fights. Placidusax is one of those bosses. Somewhat similar to Fortisax, he is pretty hidden away, and you fight him in a separate arena that's only accessible through a secret teleporting spot. There's a very great build and tension as you approach Placidusax's battle. Crumbling Farum Azula's environment has a very stark contrast to the relatively peaceful and transcendent cutscene that brings you to his arena. Everything goes silent, and the dungeon's tornado starts to reverse, as if to bring you to a time before this destruction occurred.
Thank God Shadow didn't win Game of the Year. I would have devastated. Yeah. Well, aren't the Game Awards like fucked now anyway? Just because, like, aren't they screwed now anyway? Because they're including DLC into that for no real reason besides just we need more awards available, and why not give it to a game that already won Game of the Year like 2 years ago? I've never paid attention to like game awards at all, right? I think it really just comes down to how many people have played it and how many people consistently play it, and where does it sit in the zeitgeist of the community of that game or of that sort of franchise at this point. But it is one of those things. Like if Shadow of the Erd Tree won Game of the Year, I think I would have been like, well, this is From Software. They're done. They're getting bought by Sony. Their DLC, which overcranked everything bad about the base game, is getting awards. This franchise is fucked. I'm absolutely out. I mean, I was already out, but that would have been the final nail in the coffin. Or that would have been a post-final nail in the coffin after it's buried. I think they are. Shadow robbing another game of that spot is absurd. Yeah, it's just fucking stupid. Souls players weren't helping by claiming they want Shadow to win because it'd be funny, which I didn't believe. Oh, man. A joke should be kept as a joke. It should not interfere with anything. Just damn. Anyway, let's move on. I really have to pee.
It's hard to know what to expect since many other bosses have dialogue to accompany their cutscenes, whereas Placidusax's circumstances are largely kept a mystery. When you awaken in his arena, you spot Placidusax looming in the distance, and suddenly there's this strong sense of anticipation. It's the calm before the storm, and you know that something flashy is about to go down. Invoking that sort of mood in the short time frame it takes from initiating the cutscene to starting the battle is a very strong aspect of the fight. It may not be as detailed or elaborate as, say, Radahn's build-up, but it still sets the player's expectations appropriately, and in my opinion, the fight itself does a better job at satisfying those feelings. Placidusax's destructive behavior makes for a very chaotic atmosphere that suddenly fits with the rest of the tone of Farum Azula.
I'm actually not the biggest fan of Placidusax. There's a lot of dead time when he takes the air again and you can't do anything. Yeah, I think his phase 2 is the weakest part of the fight. There are some good moves in there, but you're right. The long delay in phase 2 where he's flying around and where there's really no opening. Like there's no opening for like I think a solid maybe 20, 30 seconds, like where you can't really do anything to him unless you just trade hits, which you shouldn't want to do. You know, it's one of those things where I feel like the boss fight would have been better if some of the things in phase 2 were changed a little bit.
Many of his attacks are lightning or fire AoEs with a much larger scope than similar attacks from Fortisax or the numerous field dragons. The wide coverage of his attacks makes the fight trickier, and it took me a while to work out how exactly to dodge everything. From a mechanical standpoint, one of the best things about Placidusax is that many of his moves require a more creative, outside-the-box response that you don't really use on other bosses. For example, if you're staying behind him, sometimes one of his heads will curve back and spit fire at you. Initially, this feels pretty cheap since they're like the fire attacks from all the field dragons. It covers such a wide area that you have a very short window to start running away if you want to avoid all of the damage. It's made even more challenging with Placidusax, since you don't have access to Torrent's mobility. He's great at running away from other dragons, but that isn't an option here. All you have to do, though, is jump over his tail to the other side and get some free hits in. The tail is like the dividing line between where you can and can't be standing. These games have only been able to rely on moving and rolling when it comes to mobility options, and even though this tail response still isn't very complicated, it is a rather clever application of your limited tools. It uses a problem-solving element of figuring out how Placidusax's fire can conceivably be dodged when it covers so much ground. This is augmented further by turning the camera into a tool instead of a nuisance. Placidusax is yet another massive enemy, but for the most part, lots of what he does can actually fit on screen if you play unlocked. I always like angling the camera so that I can stay behind him to attack while still being able to see his heads and claws. It ensures that his telegraphs aren't coming out off screen so that you can actually know what to expect. The camera in Elden Ring probably hinders players a lot more than it helps, but Placidusax at least makes it a bit more satisfying to use. Making sure that the right things are always in frame is part of the challenge, and it makes you rethink the role of the camera in these games a little bit. It's something that you have full control over, and thus can be incorporated into solving some in-game problems if the developer so chooses. I also think he has some
This is the one thing I think having bosses where it's better to not use the camera just shows the problem with the camera for that particular fight in general. Bale is a great example where the camera is freaking out because the only point you can lock on is his head, and his head's constantly moving during his attacks. If you had multiple points, like maybe his head, maybe his like core being and like his stomach or something, that would help. Just two different points would help. It's just that problem where having enemies with just one lock on point, makes it very difficult to aim attacks without unlocking on, and it's one of those things where the best option in those situations is to not use the basic mechanics of the game, which kind of shows you that the basic mechanics of the game are starting to become a problem when you don't use them. It feels like half a minute as you wildly pan the camera around to find him, then you dodge and have to dodge more than he teleports to you. Yeah, it's just a very long period of just doing nothing while you're waiting for his attacks to come. It's probably the epitome of delayed attacks.
Some very creative implementation of sound later in the fight, sort of like an expansion on what Estelle did. When he starts teleporting around, he often uses a claw attack quickly after reappearing, and frantically spinning the camera around to find him can be a bit of a headache, but there are a couple clever ways to deal with it. The first is to not even bother trying to find him and just rely on the sound cue to signal your dodge. The noise he makes when winding up the claw is very distinct, so that's a perfectly viable approach. People generally have better auditory reaction time than visual reaction time anyway, so it takes a little bit of the pressure off if you decide to focus entirely on using sound. You don't have to spread your focus as thin. I've found it a bit easier to respond to positional sounds instead, though. Since Placidusax will almost always appear somewhere behind you, you can listen for the general direction that his claw noise is coming from and hopefully detect his presence that way. You can then adjust the camera accordingly instead of just rotating it everywhere and hoping for the best. I can't think of any other major instances where the game uses positional audio, so this is always a cool trick to execute. His teleportation is a bit of a double-edged sword though. While it allows for that cool sound cue implementation, it also creates another empty time problem. Pretty much every fight I've ever had with Placidusax has been very drawn out towards the end. He likes to teleport around or use his long-range breath attacks during these phases, and it takes forever before you get the opportunity to strike back again. In a way, this could help build tension since it's throwing some endurance tests at you so close to the end, but Placidusax doesn't attack super frequently, so the end result is just a bunch of running around. It's easily my biggest gripe with the fight, and it gets really obnoxious watching him run away when you know you can beat him, he's just not giving you a chance to close it out. It feels like a game of cat and mouse by that point. He also has a really annoying runback, tied for the worst in the game with Renala's, which is a more minor issue, but I still don't really understand why there isn't a Stake of Marika or even a Site of Grace in or near the arena. Those two things aside, Placidusax is a fantastic boss. I think it's the most creative fight in the game, both with how it's presented and with how his moves are structured. It's very nice to have one endgame boss that manages to hit a fantastic stride, both in gameplay as well as in presentation.
I don't really have much to add after that. It's like I don't think he's that great of a fight, but I think in terms of what they were trying to do with him, they do it pretty well. I think the tedium in phase 2 is a significant problem, though. Like it's a significant problem with how much time you spend just trying to catch up to the bastard. Aha, that's right. You survive the lasers only to get 0 punishes. Meanwhile, Midir gives you like 5 seconds of a punish. Well, I think the difference with Midir is that he's got a long wind up to his lasers that give you enough time to run up to him, right? That's the one thing that's redeemable about Midir's lasers compared to the other ones is, Placidusax flies around so much. He covers so much ground that unless you are at the edge of the arena and you know where he's going to land, like he's going to probably get a laser off. Whether you get behind him or not, he'll probably get a laser off.
Elden Ring's Rotten Cherry on top is a boss rush, and Malekith is the kickoff to that finale. His first phase, the Beast Clergyman, is probably the most egregious example of unfair punish windows in the entire game, and it ruins a good portion of the fight. I honestly think he's worse about this than Malekith. I think it's pretty clear that you're supposed to keep your distance as much as possible because he has several moves and behaviors that are specifically meant to punish close quarters play. The problem is that these countermeasures are so powerful that I'm not sure what heavy weapon users are supposed to do. When you're up close, many of his claw attacks come out almost instantly to the point where it's nigh unreactable. It's perfectly fine for some fights to be more defensive in nature, but 1, we're at the end of the game now and nearly every fight has been like that, and 2, he can still whip out these moves even after you go in to punish something slow. It's like Malenia with Waterfowl Dance, just with less damage. Even when you engage after dodging a slower move, he can immediately swing his claw around and reset to neutral. You are always risking damage by walking towards him. This is the problem with so many of these defensive fights. After you spend an eternity dodging their extended combos, when it finally looks like you have an opening to engage, you still aren't given a fair shot. It feels like he's straight up canceling his recovery animations half the time, and I can't tell if he actually is, but he can attack so often that he may as well be, which would be basically unheard of in any of the previous games, even the faster paced ones like Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3. Committing to an action has always been a very key principle in these games, but it wasn't just for players. Bosses had the exact same limitation, and that's not true anymore. Beast Clergyman has the luxury of being extremely aggressive and non-committal at the same time. He can go in, finish an entire combo, disengage, and throw a ranged attack at you, all in a third of the time it would take for you to do the same thing. It's hard to identify any of his key weaknesses at all. Unless I'm doing a magic build, I've resolved to just trade hits with him and hope I can sustain enough health to get through phase 2. You only need to put up with him for half of the health bar, so it isn't worth the time spent turtling and sneaking in a single hit every 10 or 15 seconds. When it comes to these endgame bosses, it's hard to know if hit trading is the intention for melee builds. The Beast Clergyman's fast attacks don't deal tons of damage, so it's not like you can't stomach them, but if that's what you're supposed to do, then it isn't communicated very well. Bloodborne had rallying and Sekiro had deflecting, so that hit trading could make sense, and Elden Ring has nothing of the sort. Malekith has a very similar flow to his fight, he's just better at hiding it. Like Fortisax, I really want to like him more than I do. His attacks aren't unfair in the sense that you can avoid them just fine, it's purely the timings between them that's overtuned. Now, there is a way to help circumvent this, but it's kind of disingenuous. It only creates the illusion of a more fairly paced fight because nothing about Malekith himself really changes. Having fought him several times now, I'm pretty certain that you're only meant to do it with the Blasphemous Claw. It's only optional in the same way that Mohg's Physic Tier is optional. Sure, you can fight him without it, but you're making things so much more frustrating for yourself by doing so. There's simply not enough opportunities to attack him without it. This is an item that you can get nearby in Farum Azula. If you progress Bernal's questline far enough, he'll invade you and drop the claw upon defeat. It's an unlimited use tool that allows you to parry Malekith's sword attacks, and doing so will stun him for a good few seconds so that you can counter. At first, this seems like the solution to all of Malekith's problems. It makes sense for an enemy to attack so rapidly if you're supposed to parry them. That's what Sekiro's combat system is about, and it works brilliantly in that game. It's also not consumable, so you can practice with it freely, plus it's super satisfying to hit him with, so what's really the issue? Well, first off, they did a very poor job at communicating how to actually use the Blasphemous Claw properly. All the tooltip states is that it, quote, can deflect the power of the Black Blade, when instead it should say, can deflect the power of the Black Blade sometimes. The Blasphemous Claw only works against a few of Malekith's attacks where his sword has a golden shine. The timing for the parry is actually pretty lenient, but it only works on those 2 or 3 attacks. I have no idea why the item description mentions nothing about this limitation. It's so intentionally obtuse, and I think that's led to a lot of unnecessary confusion. Players will take this item, try deflecting the first attacks Malekith throws at you, then get frustrated because none of that is working, and dismiss the claw as some kind of gimmick, or maybe it's not actually applicable to this fight at all. The entire series has always been vague with its information, so I really don't think you'd be wrong to draw that conclusion. It's also a very strange trick to work out on your own. His blade glowing gold isn't something that sticks out until you already know to look for it. The boss's attacks already have lots of visual effects on them, and that one doesn't seem any different. I honestly never would have noticed it if I hadn't known any better. So the Blasphemous Claw doesn't communicate itself very well, but let's move past that and work with this knowledge to see how it changes Malekith. If you try fighting him without the claw, your opportunities to damage him are extremely limited as a melee player. He flips through the air shooting projectiles and doing epic combo spin attacks like he's a wannabe Devil May Cry protagonist. Then when he finally lands, he either immediately runs away to start another combo or unleashes an explosion at his feet to completely halt your attempts at punishing him. Between the mobility, the explosions, and the giant AoE slash moves, there's too much about him that deters you from approaching. As a result, the least frustrating way to fight him that I've been able to discover is to not even try to aggress. You hold your ground and dodge through his moves over and over. Then when he gives you a glowing sword attack, you parry it and land some attacks yourself before he recovers from the stun. That's the cycle of fighting Malekith. He doesn't have tons of HP, so repeating that 3 or 4 times should net you the win. Despite the claw seemingly having a profound effect on the fight, this doesn't feel any different from what you've been doing the entire time. You're not actually being more aggressive or engaging with the boss any more than you would normally be. It's just that the periods of time you each have to attack each other have been lengthened. Even though he gets stunned for a long time, he also gets to attack you for a lot longer before you get a chance to parry him. The pacing of the fight isn't accelerated by the claw, it just makes things easier so that you don't have to try weaving in your own offense through his flurry of attacks. I can't deny that this is a very cool idea, and if there was a gimmick fight built entirely around a mechanic like this, I would probably be on board with that, but it doesn't end up making Malekith more interesting. I still hate that you can only attack him during the few moments that the game says you can. I honestly find Malekith a bit of a pushover if you fight him this way, so I guess the saving grace is that at least it's an easy fight. If you've done the fight without the claw and really struggled that way, I encourage you to go back and give it a try if you can. The difference is seriously night and day, and once you work out how to use it properly, it's hard to assume that this wasn't the intended method. Either way, what had the potential to be an amazing fight is ruined the same way many other fights are.
And this is one thing I'm going to catch up on chat real quick. I love Malekith. I'm sorry. If I could remove Beast Clergyman entirely, he would be my favorite fight in the game. Though I will say that he still has the typical Elden rot, larger boss being extremely agile, get off me moves, wanked damage. Yeah, I mean, I didn't say much during that whole bit because I was just in almost total agreement with what Matthew was saying. It's just the trading on Malekith is so. It's not even really like tedious as much as just prolonged, right? Like it's still tedious, but just the openings are so rare given how agile he is, you know. And it's the thing where I hardly ever use the claw. Like I don't even know where it is, right? Like I've ignored it on most of the runs I've played the game, just because I just got used to Malekith taking forever to have an opening, you know. So I would just wait until I found a place where I could have an opening, and then I would hit him with whatever I got. Right? It's just one of those things where I got used to the bullshit, and so I just ignored the item that would help with it. You know, it's like if the boss fight's going to be tedious anyway, I don't really want to go out of my way to grab an item that will make it slightly faster if I can probably beat the boss in the time it takes me to actually get the item. You know, now it's not going to be the same for everybody because we all have different levels of like confidence and skill, but it's one of those things where like I just ignore the item because I'd rather just deal with the boss anyway, just the normal way of just dealing with the bullshit. I just keep dodging, get your one poke in, and then dodge for another 30 seconds while you wait. You know, just I don't want to take part in the gimmick. You know, I just want to beat the boss and move on at this point. You know, and it just kind of illustrates the problem. It's like I love him aesthetically. Like he looks great when he's doing his moves. The cutscene's really cool. His armor's cool. The weapon's cool. He fights very much like a glass cannon in a way, but at the same time, you're spending so much time chasing after him to do just a little bit of damage that the fight mechanically is frustrating. That reminds me, that tree sentinel outside his room is such a dark omen for what's to come. Yeah, that tree sentinel is not fun, especially because it's repeated. Anyway, here we are. We're getting towards the end.
Upon my name as Godfrey.
In many ways, Godfrey addresses the frustrations I just had with Malekith. While both bosses are very relentless with lengthy combos, Godfrey is much more tolerable simply because his recovery windows are just a little bit longer. More downtime is all a lot of these bosses would need to be considerably more fair, and I think Godfrey demonstrates that quite well. At the same time, I have to concede that I'm still not a huge fan of the fight. I'm just a bit conflicted because it's difficult to explain why. Godfrey is considerably less frustrating since you aren't just staring at him flail about waiting for your opening. The two of you are almost always in close proximity to each other, so as soon as you identify an opening you can retaliate, and it's not like Beast Clergyman where he'll suddenly pull out a get off me move that deals unreactable damage. So I wouldn't say that the fight is unfair. Those openings can be a little small if you're using a heavy weapon, but overall it doesn't rob you of your victories as much. I think my conflict comes from the fact that Godfrey doesn't have a consistent rhythm the same way something like Moog and Loretta do. Moog was a bit slower, whereas Loretta ran at a pretty smooth medium speed. Both of these bosses fostered something of an internal metronome to make sure that you were always matching their pace. Whether players think about that metronome consciously or subconsciously is up in the air, but either way you could settle into something that felt very natural, and that state was never interrupted unless you died. I would say Godfrey is on the faster end, but his rhythm always fluctuates a tiny bit. Not necessarily because of delayed attacks, but because he doesn't always chain together his moves in the same way, and that creates a lot of hesitation when deciding whether it's safe to punish him or not. Sometimes it doesn't even feel like you can make an informed decision because there's no way to know what the safest option is until it's too late. That's a bit of a messy explanation, so here's an example. He has a basic 2-hit combo that sometimes he'll extend and sometimes he won't, but the time you have to identify which option he went with is too short. Attacking as soon as the 2 hits end is risky, since if he follows up, you're going to get hit, but if you choose to play it safe instead, you may have given up an opportunity to deal damage. By
Yeah, that's that. And what he's explaining with this boss specifically is my biggest criticism of the combo extensions is that because you don't know when they're coming, you end up wasting an opening that's too small for you to punish once you realize that the opening is true. Right? Like the window is so small that unless you just are gonna attack him anyway, regardless if the follow-up combo is coming or the follow-up part of the combo is coming, you're probably gonna waste the opening, which just extends the fight even longer because you don't actually know when the attack's coming. Upon my name is Godfrey, the first AoE spammer. Yes. I'm actually surprised that he didn't include Sir Gideon, the all spammy, in this list. I figured this would be on the list. I'm curious why, because that's a fight that you absolutely should talk about. Maybe he's talking about like proper fights that aren't like just NPCs that are overpowered. I don't know. It feels like a missed opportunity that he didn't talk about Gideon. It's very telling that I completely forgot about Gideon until we stopped in the middle of the Godfrey fight. Right? He's not memorable. He's just kind of a roadblock that's annoying. Nice play. I didn't know the moon spell counted as a jump spell that avoids his AoE. Yeah. The moon spells are actually kind of cool because they get you off the ground. But at the same time, it's a long wind up.
the time you realize that, it's too late to commit and he's moved into his next action. He has all sorts of these weird decision trees. Sometimes his stomp will be followed up with a close range blunt, and sometimes it'll be followed up with another stomp. Or sometimes he won't do anything at all. His attack sequences don't have any kind of pattern, and unlike Margit, I haven't been able to figure out what makes him decide to use certain moves after others. That's neither here nor there, though. The more important question is, how much should this be held against him? Is that unpredictability unfair, or is it part of the challenge? I could go either way on that one. A part of me feels like his short downtime between attacks is still a problem, because it doesn't leave you enough time to process his behavior. If you play 100% safe and don't retaliate on those unpredictable moves, then sure, you'll still be avoiding damage, but you won't be able to do anything back. If the best way to counter his unpredictable behavior is to just not engage, then by that point we're regressing back to something like Beast Clergymen. Alternatively, because Godfrey is so relentless, it's pretty clear that he forces engagement a lot more than other bosses do, so maybe it masks these problems fairly well. I feel like I really need to stress that dodging the attacks themselves also isn't unfair. Again, nothing like Beast Clergyman's claw moves, it's just the AI's behavior that's making things difficult. And even if you only engage on his guaranteed safe moves, the fight is probably better than others of its type. Ultimately, I tip more towards the cons outweighing the pros on this one because it feels like Godfrey only stands out for being the best of a bad lot. He doesn't reach any mind-blowing heights, and unfortunately, the game is almost over, so this was really one of their last chances to nail a boss fight. And Godfrey's not quite there. His second phase doesn't do him any favors either.
Gideon is obscenely overtuned, unavoidable debuff, high damage, infinite FP, infinite stamina, so you can chain cast. What the hell from soft? Yeah, he's basically a cheating player put in the game, pretty much. Like Gideon is basically just a cheating invader. Look at that damage he just took from the stomp. It nearly one-shot him. Yeah, there are too many moves where it's just and I've mentioned this before. It's like the longer the series goes, the closer we get to the realm of just lives in fights as opposed to an actual health bar. You know, because if the enemy is going to do an attack that deals enough damage to kill me in one hit, what's the point of having a health bar? You may as well just have the life system from like Pac-Man or something where one hit is enough to kill me. You know, it just kind of undermines the whole point of having a health bar when they deal absurd damage anyway.
Either. The phase transition is honestly pretty entertaining, so it gets some points for that, but I find Horalu a lot less enjoyable to fight than Godfrey, and it hurts the enjoyment of the overall boss quite a bit. The main issue with this phase is that Horalu is the king of delayed attacks. If the game wasn't chock full of these already, then it could have been a more central part of his identity to make it a curveball encounter, but instead you have yet another boss whose entire purpose seems to be built on faking you out. This is terribly frustrating when you're first learning the fight because you basically have to die to learn some of his timings, and that means repeating Godfrey several times until you can get everything down. I'll rehash this point again because it really shows with Horalu. Most delayed attacks in this game just don't look nor act naturally, and it makes it way harder to get immersed in the battle since you need to remember all of these artificially long timers.
Yeah, this is one of those things that I think a lot of the delayed attacks are very sort of, not all of them, but a lot of them have that weird sort of like freeze frame thing where it's like the boss has entered the matrix, you know what I mean? And he's getting his spinning camera moment, and then the attack comes down. Whereas we're just regular people in the audience watching him going, "Will you come down already? Like, like quit wasting my time. Get down here." You know, it's that stupid shit where they jump into the air and then hover for some reason, then they come down. You know, it just looks stupid, right? It just looks stupid. You know, like when you're dealing with like a giant person. Like if you're flying, that's one thing. Like if you're actually a flying enemy that can fly, that's one thing. But when you're just like when you just freeze in the air and then you come down, it just looks ridiculous. I think he's going to show the goofy jump grab he does where he literally defies gravity to delay a grab attack. I hope it does because Horalu's grabs are so annoying.
And at a certain point, it just looks ridiculous too. Like, this boss will slow down time for a second when he's diving towards you just so the attack can be delayed. Or he'll charge up his arm for several seconds before flailing them around because of course, having him swing like a normal person would just make too much sense for Elden Ring. Again, lots of this could have been fine if it was his signature trick, but it isn't. Horalu is also hindered by showing up at a rather inopportune time. By this point in the game, I was just tired. Tired of all the aggression, tired of all the delayed attacks, and tired of not feeling like I was actually fighting bosses, just watching them. Then Horalu shows up with all of those traits mixed in, like FromSoft just had to have the last laugh. It's a joke that goes on far too long, and by this point, we had heard it a million times already. No one is laughing anymore, and FromSoft just won't put it to rest. Godfrey and Horalu strike me as another fight with polarizing difficulty. I've seen many call them one of the easier bosses, largely due to their relatively small health pool, which is definitely true, but other people, including me, have just never been able to click with it. Godfrey's patterns are still pretty unrecognizable, and Horalu's patterns still mess me up. It's another fight that I've started to like less the more I've played. Even with that said, I probably came off as more negative than I really am on the fight, because Godfrey is still good, it's just that he's good when compared to other Elden Ring bosses, which by this point isn't a super high bar to clear.
That's one of those things where I disagree. I think he fits in with all the rest. It's got a lot of the same problems of just spamming the same shit over and over. Delayed attacks, big AoEs. You know, combo reading, pretty much. Combo extensions. He's pretty much just the same problems as all the other ones, just in a different sort of metric. He leans more towards big AoE spam as opposed to like delayed combo stuff being like his biggest issue. The Mayo, he said it. There's the grab. Rewind a little bit to that death. Notice how his foot literally tracks him. Yeah, I did notice that. It's just more of that same bullshit. Just the obsessive tracking midair is the stuff that really makes me think that just the developers are running out of ideas. He literally spins on his heel to follow you. Yeah. Got to get that tracking in. Got to get all the bullshit in. Now we get to the final fights.
It's a real shame that Elden Ring ends the way that it does. From a thematic perspective, Radagon is excellent. He's a very fitting final boss for Elden Ring, and all the visual motifs relating to the Shattering creates a nice sense of excitement when the fight begins. There's a great sense of finality. It's just squandered by a horrendous second phase that comes at a really bad time. Let's focus on Radagon first, though. I used to think that he was one of the best fights in the game, and while I still really enjoy it, he's not wonderful. There are some similarities with Godfrey here in that many of his attacks start out as melee, and sticking close to him when you dodge is a safe bet, which definitely helps make the fight feel considerably more fair despite his aggressive behavior. Maintaining a close distance between the boss and the player is a decent way to alleviate the game's shorter recovery windows, since very little of your time has to be spent walking back up towards the boss. It's often better to roll into attacks and try to stick behind him so none of the lingering hitboxes will catch you. Then when you're done dodging, you have more time to attack him since you're already in range. Compare this to something like Malekith, who has so much mobility that many of his attacks end far away from you. By the time you close the distance, he'll fly off again, as if he wasn't tested to account for that extra time. If you could dodge close to Malekith, maybe he'd be more reasonable, but you can't. Radagon did well to identify these issues and make the fight very close quarters. It also helps facilitate aggression on the player's part better, since there's potential to catch Radagon when he's in the middle of a combo. If there's a longer delay between some of his moves, you can sneak hits in during that time if you have the confidence, and that can go a long way in making the player feel like they're improving at the fight. Initially, it might feel like his giant AoE attacks force you into unsafe positions, since they cover so much ground and he can occasionally chain them together, but I found that this isn't always the case. It's mostly a matter of just iframing through them. Again, he encourages you to roll towards him, and that works on many of these moves as well. Additionally, while Radagon can have some unpredictable behavior like Godfrey did, generally speaking, there's much less hesitation when you're trying to attack him. His recovery time is more pronounced and made clearer thanks to the animation. Again, many problems with bosses just stem from timing issues, and Radagon is more well adjusted on that front. That's not to say that he's entirely free of the over-aggression trend that's been present since the beginning, though. Sometimes he can let out these really long chains where you have to dodge way too much before getting one chance to strike back. In the example I'm showing on screen right now, he attacked 9 times in succession, and I only had time afterwards to hit him once. I don't think these problems are as bad with Radagon since they're less frequent. It strikes me as an unlucky string of AI decisions rather than him being intentionally designed to be that aggressive. That doesn't change anything about how unfair it feels when it does happen, but at least it isn't an omnipresent problem.
That's one thing I was going to comment on actually is like that. I've never seen that combo that like because it looks like those first 2 combos with the hammer like repeated. Like it looked like he began a combo, then he began another combo, and then he started doing his other wind up to the sort of like ground slam explosion thing. But it's one of those things where I would agree with him on this though, is like the combos chaining like that so quickly. It's just like dude, I need room to breathe. You have to give me an opening eventually. Like, please, just give the players openings to do something. Like, we're tired of hitting the dodge button over and over. You're gonna break our dodge keys with how much you make us do it in this game. Oh yeah, he really is a fitting final boss because of the AoEs he brings in for phase 2. Let's see. Rare strafing moment in Elden Ring. I've never seen him attack that many times. That was filthy. Yeah, but it is one of those things, right? Just because it's rare doesn't mean that we shouldn't still criticize it, you know? It's similar to the thing I mentioned earlier about Melania having a chance to do waterfowl one combo and then do waterfowl again. It's just absurd that they can do that often. They should have hard timers on the big moves. I almost wish VG Matthew fought DLC Radon. Would have loved to see his takes. Oh god, I don't think he'd make it that far. And I'm not knocking the guy. I would not blame him for trying the DLC, getting to Radon, fighting him 5 times, and then giving up. It is not worth it. It is not worth it.
More of Radagon's problems arise when he starts using specific attacks. There are a couple big ones holding him back from being a top-tier fight. Incidentally, both of them go back to the inconsistent behavior issues that brought down Godfrey. The first one is the quick light blast that he can sometimes do after an initial hammer swing. Usually, Radagon's simple swings lead into a melee combo with either a heavy attack or a large AoE to close it out, and whenever that happens, it's fun to dodge. But sometimes he can swing his hammer once, then immediately shoot out a bolt of light which comes out so quickly that you barely have any time to act after dodging the initial swing. There's about 12 frames between when your roll ends and when the lightning bolt hits you, which is a very short window when you consider the variables that you need to process before deciding your action. If you just assume he's going to use his light bolts after the first swing, you can spam roll and dodge it fine, but if you do that and he decides to melee attack instead, it'll catch your roll and you'll take damage. So I would have liked to see this move have a slightly longer startup to lengthen that window a bit. It's cutting really close to being unreactable. His more frustrating attack
That's one thing I would actually disagree. I think there is enough room to dodge that. I think just the telegraphing is so fast that it's hard to predict what he's doing next. So it's one of those things where like you kind of go into defensive mode for a little bit and then you go back to playing more aggressively just to DPS him down. I'm curious what this other point he's going to say is.
is when he starts teleporting around everywhere, which has similar problems.
Yeah,
When he reappears,
I do not like the teleporting. All the combos that go into or out of the teleporting moves, I do not like. I think the teleporting just wastes. Again, it goes back to the wasting time as well as dealing damage to the player because you get hit by the teleporting and then he's immediately following up with a hit that you may or may not be able to time properly. Sometimes they get that move down, but it doesn't do much damage, so you really could just ignore it. It is one of those things. It's not a terrible move, but it is one of those things where it's kind of tough to deal with, especially on a first time playthrough where the telegraphing is so fast. The teleporting is complete AIDS. Hard staggers you, does damage, protects him from damage. Yeah.
there's no telling what he'll do. Sometimes he'll attack immediately, and other times he'll do something with a slower windup, and it becomes a 50-50 for avoiding the damage. You either roll immediately when he appears and hope he does a fast attack, or wait a little bit and hope he does a slow attack. This one can be more obnoxious because sometimes he'll teleport around multiple times in a row, and combined with the visual effects the move has, it's very hard to get a read on what he's doing. Given how Radagon is more finely tuned in other ways, I suspect that these attacks just slipped through the cracks when it came to balancing, and they didn't have time to be adjusted. Again, it signals a need for further balance patches to help repair a lot of these issues, and the more time goes on, the less hopeful I get that this will happen, but who knows. The only other attack of his that I don't really like is the Golden Grab since it's such an egregious delay, but that's a less pressing issue. None of that comes close to the worst thing about Radagon, though, the fact that he's tied to the Elden Beast. If this boss didn't exist, Radagon, and the entire game for that matter, would be markedly better. Elden Beast is the worst boss in the game, and to be frank, I don't know if I have anything constructive to say here. It's pretty incredible that this boss manages to be the worst when it's in the same game as stuff like the Valiant Gargoyles and Godskin Duo.
This is the one thing I would hard disagree. I actually don't think Elden Ring is that bad of a boss fight. I think it's really tedious, but as far as the actual combos and attacks go, I actually don't think it's that bad. Right? I think they should have included Torrent from the get-go. That the fact that they waited so damn long to include it was fucking stupid. I think that the boss running away from you 90% of the fight is terrible. And I would say that the boss fight is severely hindered by that. But overall, when you actually do fight the creature, I think it's fine. The problem is that you spend so much time chasing after the creature to actually fight it, rather than dealing with its moveset. So I think he and I might have a hard disagreement on this. As for the worst boss fight in the game, I'm thinking Fire Giant. I don't think there's many redeeming qualities to Fire Giant at all. Godskin Duo's up there. Valiant Gargoyles might be absolute cancer. And again, I'm focusing base game just because he's focusing base game here. But still, I don't think Elden Beast is that bad in terms of the actual fight. Running around is the bigger issue. It's been 2 years, VG Matthew. They ain't balancing these bosses. Yeah.
It's not even like Melania where there's some cool ideas. Everything about it is just terrible beyond redemption. I don't even know if it looks nice.
Okay, I'm starting to kind of feel. He made some comments during the Godfrey section where he was talking about how he's kind of like over the Elden Ring stuff, and he's kind of done with all the shit that Elden Ring does. And I feel like all of that contributes to the Elden Beast feeling worse than it actually is, right? Like if you take every fight in isolation, they all have problems, right? As a total package, I don't think the Elden Beast should be blamed for what every other boss did wrong beforehand, right? The Elden Beast certainly has problems, but I don't think that they're necessarily as bad as the other bosses. Like, I think the biggest problem with the Elden Beast fight is just the tedium. Like, it just takes a long time because you're constantly chasing after the boss. I think most of its move set is pretty well telegraphed, pretty fair, and doesn't deal an absurd amount of damage. I mean, and I feel like he and I are going to have a hard disagreement on this just because he called it the worst boss in the game, and he's calling it, and he's made a lot of stuff that seems like he's reviewing this boss sort of as the final boss in a long string of bosses with problems. And I feel like this boss is the sort of the breaking point as opposed to being the thing that makes the breaking point. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like everything leading up to the Elden Beast is the problem, not the Elden Beast itself. You know what I mean? Like, Radagon being tied to it drastically affects the quality of the Elden Beast fight because you have to fight Radagon again, right? Having all the bosses leading up to him in the gauntlet and the rest of the game leading up to the Elden Beast, I think negatively affects the Elden Beast. But in terms of the Elden Beast as a fight individually, I think the biggest problem is tedium. And apart from that, I don't really have any criticisms besides that, right? There might be some issues with different move sets tracking you for an extended period of time. That might be the next biggest issue, but I think the biggest one is just tedium. Just he runs away too much, and that's really it. I don't think any of his move sets actually that bad outside of those things. Elden Beast isn't that bad. Elden Stars is kind of AIDS, especially before Torrent was included. Yeah, but at that point you could stack Holy Resist stuff. I don't even really think it's defenses, really. I think it's just a matter of, just I don't think the boss fight itself is that bad. It's just everything leading up to this point makes it worse because it's just sort of more of the same.
The arena is very pretty as always, but the Elden Beast itself just looks off. See, Estelle looked like it didn't belong in the world, whereas Elden Beast doesn't look like it belongs in the game. It doesn't capture the same alien feeling, instead it looks almost cartoonish. The character design doesn't feel grounded in the same principles as the others in Elden Ring. That's just the beginning, though.
I mean, I'd hard disagree with all of those points. I think that, you know, this is meant to be sort of a god, right? So it's supposed to be on a different level than Estelle would be, because Estelle's like a proper alien, right? So like same thing with the Falling Star Beast. Like those are actual aliens. This is meant to be more of a god, so it needs to look different from them. And I think it does a decent job of looking different while also encapsulating the sort of the rune sort of structure that you can see in its like spines and throughout his limbs and stuff. I think this is a boss where we're just going to have a hard disagreement across the board, except for maybe the tedium part. He hates Elden Beast, lol. It's been years since I saw this vid, but I know he was going to drop a he doesn't belong in the game.
Even the worst of the worst fights in the game, or even the whole series, don't have anything on Elden Beast.
He keeps saying the same point, and it's like you're not actually making a point with it. I feel like this is one of those things where he's just burnt out talking about the bosses, and he didn't like Elden Beast after everything. So all of his anger towards the rest of the game is kind of getting lumped in here, which I can understand, right? There's a lot of shit leading up to this. And in terms of a fight, this is kind of lackluster, but at the same time, I don't think it's actually a bad fight. I think it really just needs 2 tweaks. I think the boss needs to not run away. You tweak that, I think it's much better. Right? Tweak that and tweak the attachment to Radigan. Other than that, I think you got a pretty good finishing boss. Bit of chaos sweeps.
The entire fight is defined by its tendency to run to the opposite side of the arena and spam magic attacks at you, attacks that you aren't even rewarded for dodging because he's too far away to do anything about it. You genuinely spend 80% of the time running towards him and 20% of the time actually dealing damage, and I really don't think I'm exaggerating those numbers. I'm not even going to go into detailed examples because I think the footage can speak for itself. It's almost comical with how terrible it is. Torrent being disabled for this fight is a decision that is completely beyond me. Not only would it help alleviate these distance problems, it also feels like almost every attack from Elden Beast is supposed to be dodged on Torrent. Elden Beast has some fire-breathing attacks kind of like the field dragons, which always give you access to Torrent. You could jump over the enclosing circle attack on Torrent. You could run away from Elden Stars on Torrent. I'm sorry for making this more of a rant, but I really don't understand it. Even if you had Torrent, I don't think the fight would be very fun, but at least it'd be tolerable. It's such a blatant oversight that's so out of character for From Software. It is also worth mentioning that the Elden Beast is the finale to this endgame boss rush that we've been going through since Farum Azula. To recap, the endgame entails fighting 7 different boss entities without any exploration or dungeon content in between. You go from Beast Clergyman to Malekith to Gideon Ofnir to Godfrey to Horalu to Radagon to Elden Beast, and that number could be boosted to 8 if you count the Draconic Tree Sentinel guarding Malekith's arena. The prospect
Now, I do think he's being very unfair here, considering that two of the bosses on that list are basically like attached, like are part 2 of a boss, right? Radigan and Elden Beast are very different fights, and they are separate entities, right? Whereas one enemy morphs into the other in terms of the clergyman to Malekith and the Godfrey to Horalu, right? I think he's being as uncharitable as possible, and I think it's to the detriment of this video, right? I've agreed with a lot of points that he's made throughout the video, but I think a lot of the criticisms leading up to the Elden Beast and dealing with the I think a lot of the criticisms dealing with the Elden Beast as the finale, I think he's letting his sort of personal experience with the game, which I do agree has a lot of problems, but I don't think Elden Beast is a problem because of everything leading up to it. And I feel like this is the biggest thing is I think Elden Ring sort of tired him out. And so by the time you get to Elden Beast after all this shit, it really feels like Elden Beast is bad when it's everything leading up to it that is bad. Or most of the things leading up to it have significant problems. Whereas Elden Beast has, I'd say, like 3 major problems. And that's really it. Just him being tied to Radigan, no torrent, and he runs away too often. I think those 3 things are the biggest problems with the fight. And personally, I think otherwise it's actually a pretty decent fight. It's just there's a lot of tedium involved because you have to reach it by fighting another boss over and over. It genuinely is one of those things where I feel like the fight itself is not actually the problem. It's like some of the random stuff tied to the fight. That's the problem. 2 years later, Torrent was added. Would love to hear Matthew's thoughts on that. Well, they're 2 years too late. Should have been here on day 1.
The prospect of doing that many fights in a row is daunting enough alone, but if these boss fights were more well-engineered, it could have made for an enjoyable challenge. Instead, it's like a boiling pot of problems designed specifically to test your patience, and to top that off with a fight as slow-paced as Elden Beast, it is a huge slap in the face to players that have spent so much time going through this swamp of combat encounters. I was practically begging for the game to end by the time Elden Beast showed up. Given that the fight lasts so long, it's very possible that you'll die a few times starting out, and that inadvertently hurts Radagon because then he pads the time it takes to power through to the end credits. He also takes up some of your resources so that you go into Elden Beast with less flasks, which increases your chances of dying. Now, I think it's only right to acknowledge that the series hasn't always tried to make their final bosses a challenge. Sekiro is really the only one that I'd say has a difficult final boss. Otherwise, it's been more of an experience designed for you to absorb the atmosphere and reflect on your journey.
That's a point I'm gonna hard disagree on, right? You look at the final bosses of each game, right? And Bloodborne's a little weird because it technically has 3 final bosses. Um, but let's just go down the list just because we're here. We can talk about it, and I also have time. It's like the final boss of Demon Souls is the true King Allant, right? Who's basically just a little sludge monster, right? Pitiful, right? Gwyn, basically a broken man. He hits pretty hard, but he's still very relatively weak, right? He's parryable, right? So you can parry him to death. A little underwhelming, but is that's kind of the point. Is like this god fell from grace pretty hard, right? And it is a thing where he still does hit pretty hard, so he's not a cakewalk per se. Dark Souls 2, depending on which boss is your final boss of the main game, it's either going to be Nashandra or it's going to be Aldia. Both of them have a fair amount of difficulty to their fights. I don't think they're good fights necessarily, but they do have a certain level of difficulty to them. In Bloodborne, you have the Wet Nurse, then you have Gurman, then you have the Moon Presence, right? All of them are difficult in different ways, right? Then you have Dark Souls 3 with the Soul of Cinder, who is very difficult given his wide range of moves across multiple builds in phase 1, and then his just damage numbers in phase 2, right? I haven't finished Sekiro yet, so I won't comment on that. But I don't really get his point here regarding the previous games having, like not having difficult bosses. Like several of these games have had difficult bosses. They might not be difficult in the exact same way, but they have had consistently difficult bosses at the end. It's not like they made a sludge monster like in Demon Souls, right? I mean, like these endgame fights might be mechanically easy to deal with once you know what you're doing, but that doesn't mean that they are technically an easy fight just because you've gotten good at the mechanics at this point, right? I don't understand like how he could go through the series as like bosses and then not see the end game fights as the majority of them being difficult, right? Like being actually difficult challenges, not like just a walk in the park. Like I don't get this. I don't get how he could get that answer. Oh no, is Matthew gonna die? I don't know. I hope not. Soul of Cinder alone is extremely hard, Matthew. At least in Elden Ring, you can get a summon, and there are spells that can melt Elden Beast. Yeah, I don't get this. Shard Spiral, for one, is really, really good for this boss.
And there's nothing wrong with that approach. If the final boss can still hit strong emotional beats, then it can work just as well, if not better. But the end of Elden Ring is so draining that players can be left too tired to fully appreciate what Elden Beast is going for. I'm pretty comfortable saying that it's worse than Dark Souls 2's final boss purely because of how much it disrespects your time. It is an offensively terrible fight, and the only way that I can think to repair it is to remove it entirely.
Wow, I think it's wow. I think it's one of those things where when you really get down to what he said about the Elden Beast, it all comes back to the tedium of chasing the boss. He didn't really complain about the movesets that much, right? He made like off comments about the star tracking thing, but then he mentioned how all the attacks can be dodged via torrent, right? But you can still dodge them normally. I feel like this fight just annoyed him personally because he hates wasted time, and I don't blame him. I hate that too, but I think this fight became the worst to him because it the boss runs away from you most of the fight, and I think that got under his skin. Objectively, though, this is not the worst fight in the game. This is not the worst boss fight in the game. It's certainly one of the most tedious. I will say that. I wouldn't say the most tedious because I think Melania has a leg up on that just because she can self heal throughout the entire fight. So I'd say that fight can become even more tedious than this one. But yeah. So let's see what his conclusion is, and then we'll wrap this video up.
Now that we're at the end, if there's anything you take away from this video, I want it to be what I'm about to say. It's a shame to end on such a negative note, but the game doesn't leave me with much choice. Bosses really fall apart towards the end with how inconsistent they are. You have greats like Loretta and Placidusax to bring the game up, followed by things like Malekith and Elden Beast to tear it all down. If we take a step back to see how all of these fights average out, the cons definitely outweigh the pros. Elden Ring's better bosses aren't good enough to be worth trudging through all of the bad ones. I think that's the main realization I had while making this video. Elden Ring is FromSoft's most ambitious, most commercially successful title to date, and one would hope that incredible combat encounters would be included in that package. Unfortunately, that isn't really the case. Through all of my playthroughs, there isn't a single boss that I get actively excited for, nothing that I specifically look forward to when starting up a new playthrough. When a boss health bar shows up in Elden Ring, it feels like an inconvenience, not a thrill. When looking back on the series in search of jaw-dropping, exhilarating combat encounters, I don't think any of the ones in this game will be easily remembered. And if they are, it won't be for anything good. Instead of remembering how much fun I had while fighting Radagon, I'm going to remember how much Elden Beast inadvertently ruined that experience. There's a lot of very compelling arguments you could make as to why this is the case. Too large of a scope, not enough development time, a lack of new ideas, no one can really say for sure. But at the end of the day, the boss fights demonstrate to me that they failed to deliver the grand convergence of all of the Soulsborne games that many were hoping for. Players have only gotten better at FromSoft games over the years, and by this point it's basically expected that their titles will be difficult. It's clear that they were looking for ways to crank that up this time around, and I really do understand that impulse given the studio's reputation. The problem is that, like every game, the Souls formula has limitations on what's possible, and if these games are to continue on into the future, I think it's about time we address that reality. Before Elden Ring came out, we were 4 Souls games deep, 6 if you want to expand that to Bloodborne and Sekiro, and with the exception of Sekiro, which is a different beast entirely, it's not like any of these games were extremely mechanically deep. You can walk, attack, block, and roll, all of which are done with single inputs. FromSoft has worked with a very limited set of player options to create over 100 different bosses across the series. And before Elden Ring came out, I would say they did a pretty damn good job. Even when they were onto their 4th Souls game, they were still producing some very good ideas. Dark Souls 3 has a very high proportion of quality bosses. But there's only so much you can do with this system before the well runs dry, and all of Elden Ring's ridiculous combos and delayed moves suggest to me that we're close to reaching that point if we haven't already. I really do think that the reason bosses are as overtuned as they are is because FromSoft didn't know what else to do. If they wanted to keep Elden Ring difficult for veterans, this might have been the only option. We've been rolling to the side, or rolling into attacks, or adjusting our positioning for over 10 years now. We've basically seen it all, so what other direction were they supposed to go? Perhaps the more important question is, has every worthwhile Souls boss been created already? To me, the solution is making some more dramatic, permanent changes to the combat system, and I know that won't go down well with everybody, but we've reached a point where Elden Ring is difficult for the wrong reasons. If turning every boss up to 11 was the only way they could move forward, then maybe it's time to re-evaluate the series' priorities. This is why I'm such a big fan of Bloodborne and Sekiro. They weren't afraid to implement some very bold new ideas. Bloodborne streamlines many defensive options and implements systems like rallying to shake things up, while Sekiro strips the combat of many essentials and manages to mold something incredibly unique as a result. Elden Ring's guard counters and jump attacks aren't enough to fundamentally change how bosses are structured. If it wanted to create its own cast of memorable fights, it needed to do more. Sticking with what they knew was obviously the safer option, and given how sky-high expectations were for Elden Ring, I can't really blame them for a lack of innovation. But I think that it signals that the way forward for FromSoft is games that retain the Souls DNA while still breaking away from many established conventions, basically what Bloodborne and Sekiro tried to do. The optimist in me has faith that they're capable of moving the series in a new direction. Sekiro proves how multifaceted their talents are, and I would be incredibly happy to see them try new, bold ideas like that. It's not like Elden Ring undoes all of the lessons they learned either. FromSoft knows how to make good games. But the more pessimistic side tells me that, given how much of a fervor Elden Ring has generated, they want to continue down this road to maintain their reputation, no matter how much the quality of their games will suffer for it. The game already shows signs of that mindset festering, and that worries me. I don't know what the future holds for From Software, but I can only hope that Elden Ring won't turn out as the title that marked the beginning of their fall from grace. Thank you for watching. As always, feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoyed. Support from the audience is always very appreciated. If you have any thoughts or feedback, please don't hesitate to leave a comment as well. I can't respond to all of them, but I do make sure to read them. Hope to see you next time.
All right, there's the video. There's our last Elden Ring video. There's our last video of 2024. It feels good. But yeah, let me catch up on chat here. See, that is definitely exhaustion as well. When you just about all the bosses have a lot of annoying parts to them, it will gnaw at you. Damn, when I see a health bar in Elden Ring, I see it as an inconvenience. You didn't have to do them like that. No, Matthew, they already did too much. Don't let them do more. You did it. I know we did it. Yeah, I can rant for about a few minutes, and then we'll end the stream. But yeah, I mean, like I largely agree with a lot of the criticisms of the bosses in general. I think the Elden Beast is more of a sum of its. I think the Elden Beast is better than he let on, but it is one of those things where I'm just sitting here wondering, like, man, how does he feel after the DLC? But at the same time, I'm done with Elden Ring content after this. Maybe we'll come back in the future, but I need like a good long break from Elden Ring stuff. I've just been dealing with too much of the shit. But yeah, I mean, I agree with his conclusion pretty wholeheartedly. It's sad to see that From Software decided to play it safe and play it tedious, for lack of a better phrase, with Elden Ring. You know, instead of inventing a new combat system like Sekiro did, which has been really engaging because it's different and new and individualized, you know, they kind of just took the old thing and just added a couple things on top of it, and then took a couple of ideas from the previous Souls games and then just added a shit ton of ideas on top of those boss fights. You know, it's essentially just it's like putting layers on, like putting layers on when it's cold outside. You eventually get to a point where you've got way too many layers where you can't do anything. You know, like they're just getting in the way of what the point of the layers are for, right? And just you'll see more of my opinions when I get this Elden Ring video finished, which I'm doing pretty well on. I decided to add some runs, so just sort of kind of like a mini update for that. I've got the 10 runs across the 5 sort of major builds I did, and I decided to add 2 additional runs, both of them where I don't use summons. One of them is from the base game, so just base new game, where I play through the entire game, beat all the major bosses without any summons at all. And then I'm going into a new game plus, like a max new game plus run, which I believe is new game plus 7. I don't think it scales any higher than that. But I'll be going into that. I'll be going into that run with a max level character, and we'll see how the game does solo from that perspective. So that'll be interesting to deal with when we get there. I haven't started recording that run yet, but I am nearly done with the first solo recording. So we'll see how that goes. So by the time this video comes out, I'm going to have 12 different runs of Elden Ring completed, where I beat every boss with 2 tank builds, 2 glass cannon builds, 2 arcane builds, 2 incantation builds, 2 sorcery builds, 2 builds where I don't summon at all. One of them in new game, another one in new game plus 7 with a max character. I'm tackling this game like a fat man out of buffet. We're just gonna eat this shit up. I have no idea when this video is coming out, but it will come out eventually at some point. So yeah, New Game Plus 7, Journey 8. I think that's where it caps. I know that's where it caps in most of the other games. But yeah, we're gonna be going into that at some point. I'm not quite sure when that video will be complete. It's sort of out of rotation with my other videos at the moment. I'm not quite sure when. Um, not quite sure when it will come out, but I am working on it. I'll be able to script it pretty soon. Once I'll be able to script it pretty soon when I get back to sort of like once I'm done with all the recordings and once I'm done with the Skyrim video, I should have a good chunk of time where I can actually finish the script for that Elden Ring video and put it out, because I'd like to put it out before the next game comes out, which I have no idea when that will be, but we'll see how long that takes. As long as I do it right, I have confidence it'll turn out good. So we'll see how that comes. All right. So if you need to see any updates for the main channel, they are on the main channel community page in the post that came out. I forget if I had it come out Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, but that houses most of the updates that need to be sort of had at this point. Just a short version. Still working on the Skyrim final part. Working on the next Remembering video for Transformers: Revenge of the Fallen. I'm going to work on the Doom and Doom Eternal commentary next for the next game I'm covering. In terms of ESAS, I'm going to continue doing it. It's been a lot of fun. Hopefully, Sekiro buffers can be more widely available. I'm trying. There's just so much. I got so much to do. January and February. Well, actually, January, February, March, and April are months where I don't do shit. So hopefully, I can get a lot of stuff done during those months. But yeah. So a lot of stuff in the pipeline on the main channel. A lot of stuff in the pipeline for ESAS. A lot of stuff in the pipeline for the gaming channel. I've got my music channel and my religious channel starting up in 2025. You can check those out in the description. They haven't uploaded anything yet, but they will start uploading in the new year. So we'll see how things go moving forward. I'm looking forward to 2025. Hopefully, a lot of good things will happen. Hopefully, so we'll see how it goes. Anyway, my balls are sweating off from my chair. It's abnormally hot in my office, and I'm ready to go have some water. I'm growing hoarse. I'm ready for a New Year's party where I can just chill. But anyway, thank you all for joining me on this journey for this stream, finishing up Elden Ring this year, finishing up that video this year. I'm glad we finished it all up. Next time, I'm planning to react to Domo 3000's response series to Mauler. This is going to be a long one because he's got several videos going over things. So I want to watch those. I'm not sure if we're going to do one video per stream or if we're going to try to break it up and just do however far we get. But we'll see how we go. So look forward to that next Saturday. I believe I'm free. So in the event I'm not free, I will try to have some Sekiro up. I keep screwing this up. And hopefully I will be able to... Oh God, Domo. I can't wait to see it. Should be fun. Anyway, that's all I have to say for now. So I hope you all had a great Christmas. Hope you all have a fantastic New Year. I look forward to seeing more of you all later. Look forward to having more fun in the coming year. Thanks for tuning in, Sheep. I greatly appreciate it. And I'm trying to spoil you as much as I can. But yeah, just again, thank you for watching. God bless, and have a great New Year's. I'm out. I'm tired.